I was with Admiral Byrd in 1947. The secret we saw in Antarctica almost condemned us. True story. Before I tell you what I saw at the bottom of the world in 1947, I need you to understand something. I'm a dead man. The doctors give me maybe 3 weeks, probably less. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate, and at 98 years old, my body's too tired to fight anymore. But that's not why I'm making this recording. I'm making it because for 77 years, I've carried a secret that's been eating me alive worse than any cancer ever could. My name is James Caldwell. They used to call me Jimmy back when I was young, and stupid enough to believe that serving your country meant the same thing as serving the truth. And I'm about to commit treason against the United States government because some secrets are too important to die with. The morphine makes it hard to think straight sometimes, but what I saw in Antarctica is burned into my memory with the kind of clarity that trauma provides. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I can tell you exactly what the ice looked like when we flew over the South Pole on February 19th, 1947. I can describe the expression on Admiral Byrd's face when we realized our instruments were going haywire. I can still feel the cold that penetrated through 3 layers of military-issue clothing and settled into my bones like it was claiming territory. Some memories don't fade with age. They just wait, patient as predators, for the moment when you're finally weak enough to let them out. I've watched them for 77 years, the men in dark suits who've been following me since I returned from Operation Highjump, making sure I kept my mouth shut about what we discovered beneath the ice. They're not as careful as they used to be. I guess when you're 98 and dying, they figure you're not much of a threat anymore. But they're still out there, parked across the street from this hospice in a black sedan that's too new and too clean to belong in this neighborhood. They think I don't notice, but I spent half my life looking over my shoulder. You don't forget that kind of vigilance, even when your body's giving up. My daughter thinks I'm delusional. Sarah visits every day, holds my hand, tells me everything's going to be okay, and pretends not to notice when I talk about the things we found in Antarctica. She was briefed by the government when she was 18, told that her father had experienced psychological trauma during military service, and that his stories about underground civilizations and advanced technology were symptoms of PTSD and early onset dementia. They paid for her college education, gave her a good job at the State Department, and all she had to do was make sure I never talked to journalists or wrote any memoirs. She thinks she's protecting me. She doesn't understand that she's been protecting them. The recorder I'm speaking into right now belonged to my grandson, Michael. He died in Afghanistan in 2009, and his mother gave me this digital voice recorder along with his other personal effects. The government men didn't know about it because it was never registered to me, never appeared on any inventory of my possessions. I've kept it hidden in the lining of my old Navy footlocker for 15 years, waiting for the right moment. This is that moment. If you're hearing this, it means I'm dead, and someone found the package I've hidden in a location that only 3 people know about, and 2 of them are already dead. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not crazy. I know that's what everyone's going to say when this recording surfaces. They'll call me a senile old man, a victim of dementia, a conspiracy theorist who let his imagination run wild in his final days. The government will produce psychiatric evaluations, medical records showing cognitive decline, testimony from my own daughter about my deteriorating mental state. They've been preparing for this possibility since 1947, building a paper trail that would discredit me if I ever decided to talk. But I've got evidence. Photographs that were never supposed to leave Antarctica. Pages from Admiral Byrd's personal diary that I stole the night before they confiscated all our mission documents. Coordinates to entrances that the government has been guarding for almost 8 decades. When you find my footlocker, you'll find the truth. The cancer started about 6 months ago, just a little pain in my gut that I ignored, because at my age, something's always hurting. By the time I finally went to the doctor, it had spread to my liver, my lungs, my bones. They offered chemotherapy, but what's the point? I've lived longer than I had any right to expect, longer than most of the men who went to Antarctica with me. Maybe I was supposed to live this long. Maybe someone needed to survive long enough to tell this story, after everyone else who could contradict it was safely dead. Admiral Byrd died in 1957, only 10 years after our expedition. Heart attack, they said, but I've always wondered if hearts attack on their own, or if sometimes they get help. I've tried to tell this story before. In 1952, I contacted a reporter for the Washington Post, told him I had information about Operation Highjump that the public needed to know. 2 days later, the reporter died in a car accident. Brake failure, they said. In 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, when people were starting to question government secrecy, I wrote a manuscript detailing everything we found in Antarctica. My house burned down 3 weeks later. The fire inspector said it was faulty wiring, but I had just had the whole house rewired the month before. The manuscript was destroyed, along with most of the photographs I'd managed to keep. In 1989, after the Berlin Wall fell, and it seemed like maybe the world was ready for truth, I tried to contact a documentary filmmaker. He agreed to meet with me, seemed interested in my story. He committed suicide before our second meeting. After that, I stopped trying. But now I'm dying, and they can't hurt me anymore. They can't take away my pension or threaten my family or burn down my house, because I don't have anything left to lose except these last few weeks of pain-filled existence. And maybe that's what they've been waiting for all along, for me to get old enough, sick enough, desperate enough to break my silence so they could dismiss me as a delusional dying man whose testimony doesn't matter because he's obviously not in his right mind. Well, I'm going to disappoint them one last time. This recording, these documents, these photographs, they're my last act of defiance against 77 years of enforced silence. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. It will contradict everything you've been taught about history, about science, about the nature of our world, and humanity's place in it. The government has spent almost 8 decades building a narrative that makes what we discovered seem ridiculous, constructing a wall of ridicule and skepticism around the truth so thick that anyone who tries to talk about it gets dismissed as a lunatic. But I was there. I flew with Admiral Byrd into places that aren't supposed to exist. I walked in cities that predate human civilization. I met beings who look human, but aren't, who've been watching our species for longer than we've had recorded history. And I've spent 77 years knowing that everything we're told about our world, our history, our place in the universe, it's all a carefully constructed lie designed to keep us from asking the questions that matter. So here it is, the truth about Operation Highjump, about what we really found in Antarctica in 1947, about why the largest military expedition to the poles in history was suddenly terminated and all records classified at levels above presidential clearance. Here's why I've been followed, threatened and silenced for most of my life. Here's why I'm committing treason with my dying breath. Because some truths are too important to die with, even if telling them means destroying whatever legacy I might have hoped to leave behind. My name is Lieutenant James Caldwell, United States Navy, and this is my testimony. May God forgive me for waiting so long to give it. December 1946. I was 21 years old, fresh out of the war, and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. I'd spent 3 years flying reconnaissance missions over the Pacific, watching from 30,000 feet as islands turned into burning hell on Earth. And I'd come home to a country that wanted to forget the war as quickly as possible. My hands still shook when I heard loud noises, and I couldn't sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch without dreaming about the B-29s falling out of the sky in flames. The Navy had offered me a discharge, a modest pension, and a thank you for your service handshake that didn't mean much when you were 21 and couldn't figure out how to exist in a world that wasn't actively trying to kill you. The telegram arrived on December 8th. exactly 5 years to the day after Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Caldwell, your presence is requested at Naval Operations Headquarters, Washington, D.C., December 12th, 0800 hours. Admiral Richard E. Byrd wishes to discuss a matter of national importance. Transportation will be provided. This is not optional. It was signed by someone whose name was just a series of initials I didn't recognize, but the official Navy seal at the bottom made it clear this wasn't a request, despite the polite language. My mother cried when I told her I had to go to Washington. She'd just gotten her son back from the war, and the idea of the military taking me away again made her hold on to me like I was already dead. I'd heard of Admiral Byrd, of course. Everyone had. The man was a national hero, one of the first aviators to fly over the North Pole, a legend in naval aviation circles, and someone whose name appeared in newspapers next to words like explorer and pioneer. What I couldn't figure out was why someone of his stature would want anything to do with a 21-year-old pilot whose only real skill was keeping a plane steady while people below were trying to shoot it down. The train ride from Boston to Washington took 12 hours, and I spent every minute of it trying to convince myself that this was just routine, that they probably wanted me to ferry some admiral around or teach flight school or something equally boring and safe. The Naval Operations Building in Washington was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. Marble floors that echoed with the sound of military boots, walls lined with portraits of men who'd shaped naval history, and an atmosphere of hushed importance that made you feel like you were walking through a cathedral dedicated to the god of warfare. They kept me waiting in an anteroom for 2 hours, just long enough to make me nervous and remind me that whatever my service record said, I was still just a kid who'd gotten lucky during the war. When they finally called me into the Admiral's office, I was so tense, my spine felt like it would snap if I moved wrong. Admiral Richard E. Byrd didn't look like the photographs I'd seen in newspapers. Those showed a confident explorer with a movie star smile and the kind of rugged good looks that made housewives swoon. The man behind the desk looked older, harder, with eyes that had seen things that didn't make it into his public lectures about polar exploration. He was 58 years old in 1946, but he carried himself like someone who'd lived multiple lifetimes. And when he looked at me, I had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through whatever facade of military professionalism I was trying to maintain. "Lieutenant Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding men in situations where mistakes mean death. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." The briefing room he led me to was deep in the building, 3 floors below ground level, with guards posted at every entrance and the kind of security measures that made it clear we were dealing with information that went beyond standard military classification. There were 12 other men in the room when we arrived, all of them pilots, all of them young, all of them wearing the same confused expression that I imagine was on my face. Byrd stood at the front of the room, next to a map of Antarctica that covered the entire wall, and waited until the door was sealed and locked before he began speaking. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the windowless chamber, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of government. Before we proceed, you'll each sign a document acknowledging that any discussion of this briefing outside this room constitutes treason, punishable by death." The documents they had us sign weren't normal military non-disclosure agreements. These were legal contracts that essentially surrendered every right we had as American citizens, binding us to silence about anything we saw, heard, or experienced during what Byrd called Operation Highjump, the largest peacetime military expedition in American history. "We're mounting an expedition to Antarctica," Byrd explained, clicking through slides that showed images of ice, glaciers, and vast frozen wastelands that looked like the surface of an alien planet. "Officially, this is a scientific and training mission. We'll be testing equipment in extreme cold weather conditions, mapping unexplored regions, and establishing an American presence in Antarctica to counter Soviet interest in the region. That's what the newspapers will report, that's what your families will be told, and that's what you'll say if anyone asks about your service. But the way Byrd said officially made it clear that there was an unofficial version of the mission that had nothing to do with science or training. He pulled down a screen and showed us photographs that had been taken by reconnaissance aircraft during the final months of World War II. Images of Antarctica that showed things that shouldn't have been there. Structures that looked man-made, carved into mountains that were supposed to be unexplored. Heat signatures in regions where temperatures should have made any kind of sustained human presence impossible. Radar anomalies that suggested large metallic objects beneath the ice. During the war, Byrd continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, we intercepted communications suggesting that the Germans had established some kind of presence in Antarctica. After the war ended, we captured several U-boats attempting to reach the Antarctic coast. The crews refused to talk, even under interrogation, but their vessels contained equipment and supplies that suggested they were planning to stay there for extended periods. The photographs Byrd showed us next were the kind of thing that made you question everything you thought you knew about the war we'd just finished fighting. German submarines docked at what looked like underground facilities. Nazi flags flying over installations that appeared to be carved into Antarctic mountains. Technical diagrams recovered from captured vessels showing bases designated as Neuschwabenland Station and Base 211, installations that officially didn't exist, but that multiple sources of intelligence suggested were very real. The Germans were exploring Antarctica as early as 1938, Byrd explained, tapping a pointer against images that showed Nazi expeditions flying swastika flags over icy wasteland. They claimed large portions of the continent for the Third Reich, and we have reason to believe they established permanent bases there before the war ended. Some of these bases may still be operational. The mission Byrd outlined made Operation Highjump sound like the largest military expedition since D-Day, only directed at a continent instead of a country. 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, a submarine, and multiple destroyers, 4,700 personnel. 33 aircraft, including the latest reconnaissance planes and helicopters. Enough supplies to sustain operations for 8 months in the most hostile environment on Earth. We'll be operating in conditions that make the worst winter warfare look pleasant, Byrd told us, showing slides of Antarctica's geography that made the frozen hell look even more inhospitable than combat zones I'd survived during the war. Temperatures averaging negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, complete darkness for months at a time, and terrain that can kill you in 100 different ways if you make a single mistake. But it was what Byrd didn't say that bothered me most. The way he hesitated before showing certain photographs, the way he'd glance at the guards posted at the doors before continuing his briefing. The way his hand trembled slightly when he talked about anomalies that had been detected by long-range radar installations during the final year of the war. There was something else going on here, something beyond hunting for abandoned Nazi bases, and the fact that they'd assembled the best cold-weather pilots in the Navy suggested they were expecting to encounter something that required not just exploration, but potentially combat capabilities. When Byrd asked if any of us wanted to withdraw from consideration for the mission, not a single man moved. We were 21 years old, we'd just survived the deadliest war in human history, and we were stupid enough to think that whatever was waiting for us in Antarctica couldn't possibly be worse than what we'd already seen. God, we were wrong. The real briefing happened 3 days later, in a room that officially didn't exist on any floor plan of the Naval Operations Building. They called it the Vault, a windowless chamber encased in layers of concrete and steel, swept daily for listening devices, with walls thick enough to survive a direct nuclear strike. Only 6 of us were invited to this second briefing. the pilots Byrd had personally selected for what he called extreme reconnaissance operations. The guards who escorted us down had to pass through 5 security checkpoints, each one requiring different clearance levels, and by the time we reached the vault, I understood that whatever we were about to learn went beyond standard military secrets. This was the kind of information that could start wars or end governments. Admiral Byrd looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 3 days since our first meeting. The confidence and authority he'd displayed before had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or patriotic speeches. "What I'm about to tell you contradicts every official narrative about the war we just fought," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge he clearly wished he didn't possess. "The Germans didn't just establish bases in Antarctica. They discovered something there. Something that may have given them technological capabilities far beyond anything the Allies developed during the war. And we need to find out what it was before the Soviets do." The photographs Byrd showed us in that second briefing were nothing like the reconnaissance images from the first meeting. These were classified intelligence documents that had been recovered from captured Nazi facilities in Germany. Technical drawings of aircraft that didn't look like any planes I'd ever seen, designed with smooth, disc-like shapes that violated every principle of aerodynamics I'd been taught. Blueprints for propulsion systems that used terms like electromagnetic field manipulation and anti-gravity drives that sounded more like science fiction than military engineering. Reports from German submarine crews describing flying objects that had paced their vessels during Antarctic voyages, moving at impossible speeds and demonstrating capabilities that suggested technology decades ahead of anything humanity had supposedly developed. In early 1945, Byrd continued, pulling up a map that showed submarine routes from Germany to Antarctica. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin, several U-boats left German ports carrying high-ranking Nazi officials, scientific personnel, and cargo that has never been fully accounted for. Most of these submarines surrendered after Hitler's death, but at least 3 continued their journey to Antarctica and were never heard from again. We've confirmed through various sources that these vessels were carrying key members of Hitler's scientific establishment, physicists, engineers, and researchers who had been working on what the Nazis called Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, advanced technology that they claimed would turn the tide of the war. The intelligence Byrd shared with us suggested that the Nazi interest in Antarctica went far deeper than just establishing a remote base to hide from Allied justice. Documents recovered from Heinrich Himmler's personal files described expeditions to Antarctica as early as 1938, led by a German naval captain named Alfred Richer, who claimed to have discovered evidence of an ancient civilization beneath the Antarctic ice. Richer's expedition had photographed over 350,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory, dropping metal swastika markers every 25 kilometers to claim the territory for the Third Reich. But it was his classified reports that were most disturbing. Descriptions of warm water lakes found in regions where such things shouldn't exist, thermal vents that suggested massive underground spaces, and magnetic anomalies that interfered with navigation equipment in ways that natural geology couldn't explain. "We intercepted communications during the war," Byrd said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, suggesting that the Germans found something in Antarctica. Not just empty ice and frozen wasteland, but something they described as Die Basis, the base. Not a base they built, but something they discovered, something that had been there for a very long time. The transmissions were vague, probably deliberately coded, but they spoke of ancient technology, advanced propulsion, and access to knowledge that predates human civilization. High Command initially dismissed these as psychological warfare, attempts to make us waste resources investigating fairy tales. But then we started receiving reports from our own reconnaissance aircraft. The photographs Byrd showed us next had been taken by American long-range patrol aircraft operating near Antarctica in late 1944 and early 1945. The images were grainy, shot from high altitude in poor visibility, but they showed things that shouldn't have been there. Disc-shaped objects flying at altitudes and speeds that no known aircraft could achieve. Heat signatures blooming from beneath the ice in regions where no human activity should have been possible. Radar returns that suggested massive metallic structures hidden under hundreds of feet of ice. We've classified these sightings as unidentified aerial phenomena, Byrd explained, using bureaucratic language that sounded deliberately vague. The Germans called them Flugscheiben, flying discs. Whatever they are, they represent technology that we don't understand, and they're concentrated in the Antarctic regions that Germany claimed as Neuschwabenland. The real mission parameters for Operation Highjump were far more aggressive than the scientific cover story we'd been given. We weren't just mapping Antarctica or testing equipment in cold weather conditions. We were conducting a full-scale military reconnaissance of suspected German installations, with authorization to engage and destroy any hostile forces we encountered. The fleet being assembled was equipped with enough firepower to level a small city. Destroyers with 5-inch guns, fighter aircraft armed with rockets and heavy machine guns, and enough Marines and demolition experts to assault and capture fortified positions. If we encounter remaining German forces, Byrd told us, his expression grim, we're authorized to use whatever force is necessary to neutralize them, but that's not what concerns me most. What concerned Admiral Byrd most, he finally admitted, was the possibility that we weren't just going to Antarctica to hunt Nazis. The intelligence community had been analyzing the German documents and communications for months, and a disturbing theory had emerged. What if the Germans hadn't developed their advanced technology, but had discovered it? What if Antarctica held evidence of a civilization that had existed before recorded human history? A civilization that had achieved technological sophistication far beyond our current capabilities. And what if that civilization, or remnants of it, was still present in some form? The official mission is to locate and neutralize any remaining German military presence in Antarctica, Byrd said, his voice carrying a weight that made the temperature in the vault seem to drop 10 degrees. The unofficial mission is to determine what the Germans found there and whether it poses a threat to American national security. The fleet that assembled at Norfolk Naval Base in December 1946 was the largest polar expedition in history, and it looked more like an invasion force than a scientific mission. The flagship was the USS Mount Olympus, a command ship bristling with communication arrays and radar equipment. We had the USS Philippines Sea, a Ticonderoga-class aircraft carrier capable of launching dozens of aircraft in rapid succession. The submarine USS Senate for underwater reconnaissance and potential combat operations. Destroyers, icebreakers, supply vessels, and support craft. An entire naval task force designed to project military power into the most hostile environment on Earth. I stood on the deck of the Mount Olympus the day we departed, December 2nd, 1946, watching the American coastline disappear over the horizon. And I remember thinking that this felt less like exploration and more like we were going to war against an enemy we didn't understand. The crossing to Antarctica took weeks, and during that time, Byrd gathered his select group of pilots for additional briefings that grew increasingly bizarre. He showed us more intelligence reports describing German experiments with electromagnetic propulsion, documents suggesting the Nazis had been researching something they called Vril energy, a theoretical power source that supposedly existed in vast quantities beneath the Earth's surface. He shared testimonies from captured German scientists who spoke of the Masters, who lived in the Antarctic interior, beings of advanced intelligence who had supposedly shared knowledge with select Nazi researchers. Most of us assumed this was propaganda or delusion, the desperate fantasies of men who'd lost a war and needed to believe they'd been on the verge of supernatural victory. But Byrd took it seriously enough to ensure we were briefed on engagement protocols for encounters with unknown entities and technology of uncertain origin. We were going to Antarctica, prepared to fight Nazis, but Admiral Byrd was preparing us for the possibility that we might encounter something far stranger and far more dangerous than anything we'd faced during the war. We crossed the Antarctic Circle on January 1st, 1947, and the moment we passed that invisible line of latitude, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden storms or catastrophic equipment failures, but subtle shifts that accumulated into a pervasive sense of wrongness. Compass needles that had pointed true north for thousands of nautical miles began spinning lazily, as if magnetism itself had become uncertain. Radio communications developed a strange echo, our voices coming back to us delayed by seconds that shouldn't have existed in real-time transmission. And the sky, even in the brief hours of Antarctic summer twilight, had a quality that I'd never seen anywhere else on Earth. A kind of luminescence that seemed to come from beneath the clouds rather than above them, like the atmosphere itself was reacting to something hidden below the ice. The first 48 hours after we established our base camp near Little America were a masterclass in things going systematically wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by weather or equipment malfunction. Our meteorological instruments reported atmospheric pressure readings that changed by the hour, fluctuating wildly without corresponding weather changes. Temperature sensors gave conflicting data, showing differences of 20 degrees Fahrenheit between devices positioned only meters apart. Aircraft altimeters became unreliable, showing altitude variations of several hundred feet even when planes were sitting motionless on the ice. The Navy's official position was that we were experiencing unusual magnetic anomalies due to our proximity to the South Magnetic Pole, but I'd flown navigation missions over the Arctic during the war, and I'd never encountered anything like this. The visual anomalies started on our second night in Antarctica. I was on watch duty, scanning the horizon through binoculars from the observation deck of the Mount Olympus, when I saw lights in the sky that had nothing to do with stars or aurora australis. They moved with purpose and intelligence, changing direction at angles that would have torn apart any aircraft I knew about, accelerating to speeds that turned them into streaks of luminescence before stopping dead in the air without any deceleration. I reported what I saw to the officer of the watch, who told me that 6 other observers had reported similar sightings in the previous 12 hours. Probably atmospheric phenomena, he said, but his voice carried the kind of uncertainty that comes from officers who are following orders to dismiss things they can't explain. Reflection of ice crystals or electromagnetic discharge. Admiral Byrd wants all unusual observations logged but not discussed with the general crew. The discovery of the Nazi installation came on our 3rd day during a reconnaissance flight over a region the Germans had designated as Neuschwabenland. We were flying in a PBM Mariner seaplane, skimming low over coastal ice shelves, when our radar operator picked up metallic contacts where our maps showed nothing but unexplored ice. Lieutenant Commander David Bunger, who was piloting, decided to investigate, and what we found made me understand why the Germans had been so interested in this frozen hell. Carved into the side of a mountain, partially concealed by ice but unmistakable once you knew what to look for, was an entrance approximately 50 feet high and 70 feet wide, perfectly rectangular, too precise to be natural formation, leading into darkness that our searchlights couldn't fully penetrate. Bunger brought the seaplane down on a patch of clear water, another impossibility, liquid water, in a region where everything should have been frozen solid. And we took a motorboat to shore to investigate on foot. The installation's entrance was marked with faded Nazi insignia, swastikas that had been painted over, but were still visible beneath newer coats of paint. The doors themselves were massive steel constructions, partially open, as if whoever had been using this facility had left in a hurry. Inside, we found evidence of recent occupation: German military equipment, fuel drums dated 1945, provisions that looked like they'd been abandoned within the past year. But it was what we found deeper inside that convinced me we were dealing with something far beyond a simple Nazi hideout. The installation extended into the mountain for what must have been hundreds of yards, a network of tunnels and chambers that had been carved with precision that suggested industrial machinery far more advanced than anything I'd seen during the war. The walls were smooth, almost glass-like in places, and warm to the touch despite the freezing temperatures outside. We found barracks that could have housed hundreds of personnel, laboratories filled with equipment I didn't recognize, and storage chambers containing crates marked with German text that referred to exotic materials and energy research. But the most disturbing discovery was in what appeared to be a central control room. Banks of instruments that were still powered, panels displaying readouts in German, and symbols I'd never seen in any language, and a map covering an entire wall that showed not just Antarctica's surface, but an entire network of tunnels, chambers, and installations beneath the ice. Lieutenant Commander Bunger photographed everything while I provided security with my sidearm drawn, though I had no idea what I was supposed to be guarding against. The installation felt like a tomb, silent, empty, but somehow still alive, as if we were trespassing in a place that was just temporarily unoccupied rather than permanently abandoned. We found logbooks written in German, technical manuals describing equipment that violated physics, as I understood it, and photographs showing German personnel posing with objects that looked like they belonged in a science fiction magazine rather than a military installation. In one photograph, a group of Nazi officers stood next to what appeared to be a perfectly circular craft, maybe 30 feet in diameter, hovering 3 feet off the ground with no visible means of support. The communication problems escalated dramatically while we were inside the installation. Our radio contact with the Mount Olympus became impossible to maintain. Every transmission was overwhelmed by interference that sounded almost like voices speaking in frequencies just outside human hearing range. When we tried to use our emergency beacon, it activated equipment throughout the installation, causing lights to flicker on in chambers we hadn't explored, and setting off what sounded like alarms that echoed through the tunnels with a pitch that made my teeth ache. We made the decision to evacuate immediately, gathering as much documentation as we could carry and retreating to our seaplane before whatever we'd awakened in that place decided to manifest. The flight back to base camp should have taken 40 minutes. It took 3 hours, and none of us could adequately explain why. Our instruments showed that we were maintaining correct heading and speed, but landmarks that should have appeared within minutes took hours to reach, as if distance itself had become elastic. We had visual contact with objects in the sky that paced our aircraft, disc-shaped forms that maintained precise formation with us regardless of our speed or direction changes. They didn't attack or interfere, just observed, and somehow that was more terrifying than overt hostility. By the time we landed at Little America, the entire crew was pale and shaking, and Lieutenant Commander Bunger looked like he'd aged a decade during the flight. Admiral Byrd's reaction to our report and the materials we'd recovered confirmed what I'd been suspecting since we crossed the Antarctic Circle. He'd been expecting us to find something like this. He wasn't surprised by the Nazi installation, wasn't shocked by the advanced equipment, wasn't even particularly disturbed by our description of the objects that had followed us back to base. "This is exactly what intelligence suggested we'd find," he said, examining the German documents with an expression that mixed triumph and dread. "The Nazis were here, they found something, and they were using it. The question now is whether whatever they found is still active and whether it's aware of our presence. His use of the word aware sent chills down my spine because it implied intelligence and intent rather than just abandoned technology. That night, the first casualties occurred. 2 Marine sentries on perimeter patrol simply disappeared from their posts, leaving behind their weapons and equipment, but no signs of struggle or indication of where they'd gone. Search parties combed the area for hours, but found no trace of them, not even footprints in the fresh snow, as if they'd been plucked out of existence. The official report classified their disappearance as lost in hostile environment, but everyone who'd been in Antarctica for those first 48 hours knew better. We weren't alone on this continent, and whatever shared this frozen waste with us had just announced its presence by taking 2 of our men. Admiral Byrd ordered increased security, weapons to be carried at all times, and no personnel to venture outside base camp perimeter without explicit authorization. We'd come to Antarctica to hunt Nazis and investigate anomalies. Instead, we'd found evidence that we were the ones being hunted, and the 48 hours that followed would prove just how unprepared we were for what was waiting in the ice. February 19th, 1947. The date is burned into my memory because it's the day I stopped believing in the world as I'd been taught to understand it. Admiral Byrd had selected me personally to accompany him on what he called a deep reconnaissance flight, a mission to explore regions beyond the mapped areas of Antarctica, following coordinates that had been extracted from the German documents we'd recovered. We took off at 0600 hours in a modified R-4D transport aircraft, just the 2 of us and a navigator named Lieutenant Bill Kearns, flying into the kind of unknown that makes even experienced pilots check their parachutes twice. Byrd was unusually quiet during pre-flight, and I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed our flight plan, a route that would take us over the South Pole and into regions that literally didn't exist on any map. The first hour of flight was routine by Antarctic standards, which means it was terrifying by any normal measure. Howling winds that buffeted our aircraft like a toy, visibility that dropped to near zero when ice crystals filled the air, and temperatures so cold that frost formed on the inside of the cockpit windows, despite our heating systems running at maximum capacity. But it was when we crossed beyond the mapped regions, penetrating into what the German documents had called das innere Land, the inner land, that reality started to fracture. Our compass spun wildly before fixing on a heading that pointed not north, but down, as if magnetic north had somehow relocated beneath our feet. The radio filled with interference that cycled through frequencies like someone was searching for the right channel. And through the static, I could have sworn I heard music, not human music, but tones and harmonies that followed patterns my brain couldn't quite process. Admiral Byrd was keeping a journal during the flight, writing observations in a leather notebook that he kept close to his chest, like it contained state secrets. Years later, after his death, portions of that journal would leak and be immediately dismissed as forgeries or the ravings of a man suffering from altitude sickness. But I was there, and I watched him write entries that described what we were seeing with the precision of a trained observer who knew his testimony would be questioned. "Intro 9-10 hours, he wrote, his voice barely audible over the engine noise as he read aloud. "We are crossing over small mountain range and into what appears to be a valley. This is impossible. No valley of this nature should exist at this latitude and altitude. Instruments are malfunctioning. Temperature gauge reading 45 degrees Fahrenheit. This cannot be accurate." But it was accurate. As we descended through a gap in the mountains that shouldn't have existed, we entered an environment that violated every principle of Antarctic geography and climate. The ice disappeared, replaced by rocky terrain covered in vegetation, not just lichen or hardy moss, but actual trees, forests of conifers that stretched across valley floors and up mountainsides like we'd somehow been transported to a temperate zone thousands of miles from our actual location. Lakes of liquid water reflected sunlight that seemed brighter and warmer than it should have been at this latitude. And as we flew lower, I could see that the vegetation was lush, healthy, thriving in conditions that should have killed it instantly. "This is impossible," I said. The first words I'd spoken in an hour, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, higher pitched, as if the air pressure had changed despite our altimeter showing we were still at 10,000 feet. Admiral Byrd didn't respond immediately. He was pressed against the cockpit window, his journal forgotten, staring at the landscape below us with an expression that mixed wonder and terror in equal measure. "It's not impossible," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just that everything we've been taught about this continent is wrong. The Germans knew. That's why they came here. That's why they never wanted to leave." He pulled out the German map we'd recovered, the one showing the network of tunnels and chambers beneath Antarctica. And I saw that the valley we were flying over was marked on that map with a single word in German: Agatha. The structures appeared gradually as we flew deeper into the valley, and at first I thought they were natural rock formations, pillars and archways that happened to resemble architecture through some geological coincidence. But as we descended to 5,000 feet, the truth became undeniable. These were buildings, or what remained of buildings, constructed from materials that caught the light in ways that stone shouldn't. Some were partially collapsed, consumed by the vegetation that had grown over them across what must have been centuries or millennia. Others stood intact, their surfaces smooth and unmarked by time, as if they'd been built yesterday or would stand until the end of time. The architecture was unlike anything I'd seen in my limited experience with ancient ruins. No right angles or obvious structural supports, but flowing organic curves that seemed to grow from the ground rather than being built upon it. Admiral Byrd made the decision to descend further, bringing our aircraft down to 2,000 feet, despite the fact that we were now flying through territory that existed in no official records and following a flight plan that had never been approved by Naval Command. The valley stretched for what must have been hundreds of miles, a pocket of impossible climate and impossible civilization hidden in the most inhospitable region of Earth. We saw animals, or what looked like animals from our altitude, moving through the forests below, large forms that might have been mammals, though their movement seemed wrong somehow, too fluid and purposeful for wildlife. "Are those?" Kearns started to ask, but the question died as we all saw what appeared to be structures that were definitely not ruins, buildings that showed signs of current habitation, with what might have been smoke rising from openings in their roofs. The aircraft's engines began sputtering as we descended past 1,500 feet, not from mechanical failure, but from something that affected the very combustion process that kept us aloft. Our propellers were still turning, fuel was still flowing, but the engines were losing power, as if the air itself had become less conducive to combustion. Admiral Byrd fought with the controls, trying to maintain altitude while looking for a place to make an emergency landing. And that's when we saw them clearly for the first time. Beings, I can't bring myself to call them people, though they were humanoid in form, standing in a clearing below us, looking up at our struggling aircraft with what I can only describe as curiosity rather than alarm. They were tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet in height, with features that were human-like but too perfect, too symmetrical, as if someone had taken the concept of human beauty and refined it beyond the point where it felt natural. "They're waiting for us," Byrd said, and there was resignation in his voice, the tone of a man who'd suspected this moment might come and had been dreading it since we crossed the Antarctic Circle. He managed to level the aircraft, coaxing enough power from the failing engines to slow our descent to something survivable, and found a stretch of flat ground near the clearing where the beings stood watching. The landing was rough. We bounced twice and slid nearly 200 feet before coming to a stop that threw us against our harnesses hard enough to leave bruises. But we were down, alive, and stranded in a place that couldn't exist. surrounded by beings that shouldn't exist, in a valley that would never appear on any map, because admitting its existence would mean admitting that everything humanity believed about our world was fundamentally wrong. As the engines died and silence replaced the roar of propellers, we sat in the cockpit and stared through the windows at the beings who approached our aircraft with movements that were too graceful to be human. They didn't hurry, didn't appear threatening, but there was something in the way they moved that made it clear we weren't the ones in control of this situation. "Listen to me carefully," Admiral Byrd said, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also the tremor of fear. "Whatever happens next, whatever they show us or tell us, we document everything. We're witnesses to something that the world needs to know about, even if that knowledge destroys everything people believe about history and civilization and humanity's place in the universe. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I didn't really understand anything except that we'd flown beyond the edge of the known world and found something that had been waiting here long before humans learned to build fires or shape tools. We'd come to Antarctica looking for abandoned Nazi bases. Instead, we'd found proof that we were not alone on this planet, and that we'd never been alone, and that the beings who shared this world with us had been watching us from the shadows since before we learned to call ourselves civilized. We sat in the cockpit for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the beings approach with movements that seemed almost choreographed in their precision. None of us spoke. What words existed for a moment like this? What training prepared you for first contact with intelligence that clearly predated human civilization by thousands or millions of years? Through the cockpit window, I could see them more clearly now. 9 figures, all of similar height and build, wearing garments that looked like they were woven from light itself, fabric that shifted colors as they moved through the strange sunlight of this impossible valley. Their faces were beautiful in the way that classical sculptures are beautiful, but there was something unsettling about that perfection, as if human features had been refined past the point where they registered as truly human. The leader, I assumed he was the leader because he walked slightly ahead of the others, stopped approximately 20 feet from our aircraft and raised his right hand in what might have been a gesture of greeting or might have been a command. When he spoke, his voice carried across the distance with perfect clarity despite no apparent amplification, and the words he used were English, but English spoken with an accent I'd never heard before, as if he'd learned the language from studying ancient texts rather than from conversation with living speakers. "Admiral Richard Byrd of the United States Navy," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Lieutenant James Caldwell, age 21, pilot. Lieutenant William Kearns, navigator. We have been expecting you. Please exit your aircraft. You will not be harmed if you cooperate." Admiral Byrd's hand moved to the pistol holstered at his side, a reflexive gesture that the being noticed immediately. "Your weapons will not function here," the being said, his tone neither threatening nor apologetic, just stating a fact with the same certainty you might use to describe gravity or the passage of time. "The field that surrounds this valley interferes with chemical combustion and electromagnetic discharge. Your aircraft's engines failed for the same reason your firearms will not fire. We mean you no harm, but we cannot allow armed violence in this place. It is sacred ground." The way he said sacred carried weight that suggested meanings beyond religious reverence, implications that my 21-year-old mind couldn't quite grasp, but that made the hair on my arms stand up. We exited the aircraft slowly, hands visible and empty, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that soldiers use when they're not sure if they're prisoners or guests, but want to avoid becoming corpses. The moment my boots touched the ground, I felt it. A sensation like mild electrical current flowing up through the soil and into my body. Not painful, but deeply unnerving, as if the earth itself was examining me at a cellular level. The temperature was impossible. I'd guess around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm enough that I started sweating in my cold weather gear. Warm enough that the vegetation around us was thriving in conditions that should have been flash-frozen solid. The air smelled wrong too, or rather too right, cleaner than any air I'd breathed before, almost sterile in its purity, lacking the industrial undertones that I'd grown accustomed to in cities and military bases. The being who'd spoken stepped closer, and I got my first clear look at his face. His eyes were the most disturbing feature. Blue, impossibly blue, like someone had taken the color of glacial ice and given it depth and luminescence. But it wasn't the color that disturbed me. It was the intelligence behind those eyes, an awareness that felt ancient and vast, as if I was being observed not just by an individual, but by something that possessed knowledge accumulated over timescales that made human history look like a brief footnote. "I am called Haldor," he said, pronouncing the name with syllables that didn't quite fit together in ways that English phonetics could fully capture. "I serve as..." The closest translation would be guardian or perhaps shepherd of this sanctuary. "You have entered the inner realm, a place that your governments have sought for decades but have been prevented from reaching until now." Admiral Byrd found his voice, though it came out rougher than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the command authority that usually characterized his speech. "Why now? Why allow us to reach this place if you've been preventing others?" Haldor's expression shifted slightly, and I realized he was attempting what might have been a smile, though the result was something that looked more like a wince, as if the facial expression was one he'd studied but never quite mastered. "Because your species has reached a threshold," he said, his voice dropping to something that almost sounded like sadness. "You have unlocked the power of the atom. You have demonstrated the capacity to destroy, not just yourselves, but all life on your world's surface. The Council of Elders has determined that contact can no longer be delayed, that warnings must be delivered even if those warnings are unlikely to be heeded." He gestured for us to follow, and we did, lacking any better options, and increasingly aware that we were operating entirely at the mercy of beings who could apparently control physical forces we didn't understand. Haldor led us away from our aircraft, along a path that wound through the forest of impossible trees, conifers that I initially mistook for species I recognized, but which revealed themselves on closer inspection to be subtly wrong, as if they'd evolved along different paths from anything that grew on Earth's surface. The path itself was another impossibility, paved with a material that looked like polished stone, but felt warm and slightly yielding under our boots, as if we were walking on something organic rather than mineral. Every few hundred yards, we passed structures that emerged from the forest, pillars carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, archways that framed views of the valley that seemed to shift perspective based on the angle of observation. The ruins, though ruins felt like the wrong word for structures that seemed more dormant than destroyed, grew more frequent as we penetrated deeper into the valley. Some were partially consumed by the vegetation, stone or metal, or some material that combined properties of both, being slowly reclaimed by the forest that had grown over it across centuries or millennia. But others stood pristine and intact, their surfaces unmarked by weather or time, buildings that could have been constructed yesterday or 10,000 years ago with equal probability. The architecture defied every principle I'd learned about construction and engineering. Walls that curved impossibly without apparent structural support. Doorways that seemed to exist at angles that shouldn't have been stable. Windows that showed reflections that didn't match their surroundings. We stopped at what Haldor called the archive, a structure that rose from the valley floor like a crystalline mountain, its surface catching and refracting sunlight into patterns that moved across the ground like living things. The material it was constructed from looked like glass or crystal, but when I touched it, it felt warm and slightly responsive, as if it was aware of the contact. "This structure predates your species by more than 50,000 years. Haldor said, watching our reactions with what might have been curiosity or might have been pity. It contains records of civilizations that rose and fell before humans learned to control fire. Your German visitors found this place in 1938. They spent months attempting to access its contents using methods that ranged from sophisticated electronic instruments to crude explosives. They succeeded only in convincing the archive to reveal limited information, knowledge that they interpreted through the lens of their particular ideology, and used to develop technology that nearly won them their war. Admiral Byrd was staring at the structure with an expression I couldn't quite read. Wonder mixed with something that might have been recognition, as if he'd seen images of this place before or dreamed about it during his previous polar expeditions. The Germans claimed they found evidence of an ancient Aryan civilization, he said quietly. They called this place the home of the Übermensch, the superior race that would guide them to global dominance. Was any of that true? Haldor's expression shifted to something that definitely looked like disgust, the first strong emotion I'd seen him display. The Germans found what they wanted to find, he said. The archive shows each visitor reflections of their own nature, reveals knowledge filtered through their existing beliefs and desires. Your Nazi archaeologists came seeking proof of racial superiority and weapons to dominate their enemies, so that is what the archive showed them. Distorted truths that confirmed their prejudices while concealing deeper realities they were unprepared to comprehend. The other beings who'd accompanied Haldor had positioned themselves around us in what might have been a protective formation or might have been a containment strategy. I couldn't tell which, and I suspected the difference might not matter from their perspective. One of them, a female whose features were somehow even more unsettlingly perfect than Haldor's, approached Admiral Byrd and placed her hand near his chest without touching him, moving it in patterns that looked almost like she was reading something invisible. "This one has been here before," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made it sound like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "Not physically, but his consciousness has touched this place through dreams and visions. The archive has been preparing him for this meeting for years." Byrd's face went pale, and I saw his hands start to shake. The first time I'd ever seen the Admiral show visible fear. As the sun moved across the impossible sky of this hidden valley, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects creating them, I stood in front of an archive of knowledge that predated human civilization by 50 millennia and tried to process the implications of what I was witnessing. We'd come to Antarctica following German maps, expecting to find abandoned Nazi installations and perhaps some unusual geological formations. Instead, we discovered proof that human history, as we understood it, was a lie. That advanced civilizations had risen and fallen before our ancestors learned to use tools, and that beings who looked human but clearly weren't had been observing our species from hidden sanctuaries while we stumbled toward the atomic age. The structures around us, the impossible valley, the beings who called themselves guardians, all of it represented knowledge that would overturn every foundation of human understanding about our origins, our place in history, and our assumptions about being alone in the universe. And as Haldor led us toward the archive's entrance, a doorway that seemed to open in response to his proximity without any visible mechanism, I realized that the discovery we were about to make would either save humanity or condemn us. And we wouldn't know which until it was far too late to change course. The entrance to the archive opened like a living thing, the crystalline material flowing aside to reveal a passage that descended into darkness that somehow glowed from within, an impossibility that my eyes reported but my brain refused to process. Haldor gestured for us to enter, and when Lieutenant Kearns hesitated, two of the other beings moved closer in a way that made their intent clear. We could walk willingly or be compelled, but we were going inside regardless. Admiral Byrd went first, his shoulders squared with the kind of dignity that naval officers maintain even when they're terrified, and I followed, because the alternative was standing alone in an impossible valley surrounded by beings who could apparently manipulate physics itself. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped 20 degrees and the air became thick with something that wasn't quite humidity, but felt like presence, as if the space itself was aware and observing. The passage descended for what must have been hundreds of feet, though the journey felt both instantaneous and eternal in ways that suggested the architecture wasn't constrained by normal spatial relationships. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent light that shifted through colors I didn't have names for, hues that existed somewhere between the visible spectrum and something my brain interpreted as sound or emotion rather than sight. Haldor walked beside us, his footsteps making no noise against the crystalline floor, and occasionally he would gesture at symbols carved into the walls, glyphs that seemed to writhe and change when you looked at them directly. "Your German visitors called us the Ariani," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the passage, a corruption of our actual designation, filtered through their interpretation of Norse mythology and their obsession with finding ancient Aryan ancestors. "We are neither gods nor ancestors of your surface races. We are custodians, watchers, the last remnants of a civilization that learned too late the price of technological advancement without wisdom." The passage opened into a chamber so vast that my mind struggled to accept its scale. We had to be deep underground now, miles beneath the Antarctic ice, but the space above us suggested open sky, a dome that showed stars that weren't in any configuration I recognized from my navigation training, constellations that shifted and moved as if I was watching time-lapse footage of galactic rotation. The chamber floor was a city, or what remained of one, stretching in all directions further than I could see clearly through the strange light that permeated the space. Buildings rose in spirals and curves that defied gravity, connected by bridges that looked like they were woven from solidified light. Some structures were clearly damaged or abandoned, but others glowed with internal illumination that suggested current occupation. And throughout the city, I could see movement, hundreds or thousands of beings like Haldor, going about activities that might have been daily life, or might have been something I had no frame of reference to understand. "Welcome to Agartha," Haldor said, and the name carried weight that made the air feel heavier. The last sanctuary of the elder race, the final refuge of those who chose preservation over extinction when the surface world became inhospitable to our kind. This city has existed beneath your Antarctica for more than 40,000 years, inhabited by descendants of those who fled the cataclysms that reshaped your world's surface and drove most advanced civilizations into extinction or forced regression. We have watched your species evolve from primitive tool users to masters of atomic fire, and we have debated for millennia whether to reveal ourselves or remain hidden until you destroyed yourselves and allowed the surface to recover in your absence. Admiral Byrd was turning in slow circles, trying to take in the impossible vista of the underground city, and I saw tears streaming down his face. Whether from awe or terror or some combination of both, I couldn't tell. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many of you are there?" Haldor's expression shifted to something that might have been sorrow. "Here in Agartha, perhaps 10,000, in similar sanctuaries scattered throughout your world's deep places, beneath the Himalayas, deep in the Amazon basin, under the ocean floors of your Pacific and Atlantic, perhaps 100,000 in total. We are the remnants, Admiral Byrd. The survivors of races that once numbered in the billions, reduced to caretakers of knowledge we can no longer fully use, guardians of technologies we preserve but dare not employ, witnesses to the rise and fall of surface civilizations that repeat the same mistakes we made countless millennia ago. What happened next is difficult to describe in linear terms because it involved technology or abilities that operated outside conventional physics. Haldor raised his hand, and the space around us changed. not dramatically, but in subtle ways that accumulated into a profound alteration of reality. The air thickened until it felt almost liquid, and through this medium, images appeared, not projected onto screens or surfaces, but manifesting as three-dimensional constructs that we could walk around and examine from different angles. These were recordings, I realized, historical documents captured by methods that made photography and film look like cave paintings. "Before we discuss the future," Haldor said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone delivering a prepared lecture, "you must understand the past. You must know what your species is repeating, what cycle you are perpetuating, and what consequences await if you continue on your current trajectory." The images showed cities that dwarfed modern New York or London, metropolises of crystal and metal that rose miles into skies that looked Earth-like but subtly wrong. The sun was too red, the moon too large, or perhaps these were memories from before some cataclysm had altered Earth's orbital mechanics. I saw beings that looked like Haldor and his people, but also beings that were clearly different species. Some more human-like than the Ariani, others so alien that my mind struggled to classify them as living creatures at all. 12,000 years ago, Haldor narrated, the surface world supported multiple advanced civilizations, some reaching technological sophistication that matched or exceeded your current capabilities. They developed atomic power, as you have. They split the atom and harnessed its energy for both creation and destruction. And like you, they allowed political tensions and ideological differences to escalate into conflicts that employed weapons they didn't fully understand against enemies they dehumanized into abstractions. The images shifted to show warfare on scales that made World War II look like a border skirmish. Cities vanished in flashes of light that looked similar to the atomic detonations I'd seen in classified footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but more powerful, more complete in their devastation. Entire continents burned, oceans boiled. The atmosphere itself seemed to catch fire, and through it all I could see the crystalline cities of the Ariani crumbling as whatever catastrophe was unfolding affected even those who tried to remain neutral. "We called it the Great Forgetting," Haldor said, his voice heavy with grief that felt genuine despite the emotional distance his species seemed to maintain. A war that employed weapons capable of fracturing reality itself, of creating tears in the fabric of space-time that destabilized the physical laws your universe depends upon. The surface civilizations destroyed themselves completely. Your current humanity descends from the survivors, primitive tribes who'd never achieved technological sophistication, or regressed survivors of the advanced races who'd lost everything and had to rebuild from almost nothing. Admiral Byrd had stopped crying, his face now showing the kind of professional composure that naval officers use to mask overwhelming emotion. "And you?" he asked. "Your people survived. Why didn't you help rebuild? Why didn't you share your knowledge with the survivors?" The images shifted to show the Ariani retreating into vast underground chambers, sealing themselves away from a surface world that had become toxic with radiation and destabilized physics. "We tried," Haldor said quietly. "For centuries after the catastrophe, we sent expeditions to the surface, attempting to guide the survivors toward rebuilding civilization along more sustainable paths. But knowledge given is rarely knowledge earned. The surface tribes we helped either worshipped us as gods, which corrupted our intentions, or fought us as demons, which forced us to withdraw. And so we made a choice. We would retreat to our deep sanctuaries, preserve what knowledge we could, and watch. We would observe as your species evolved from scratch, developing its own technologies and making its own mistakes. And we would only intervene if you approached the threshold we had crossed, the point where your weapons became capable of not just destroying human civilization, but damaging the planet itself beyond recovery. The demonstration of their technological capabilities was almost casual in its execution, but terrifying in its implications. Haldor gestured to one of his companions, a male Ariani, whose name I never learned, who produced what looked like a small crystalline device, no larger than a deck of cards. He placed it on the ground between us and stepped back, and the device activated with a sound like tuning forks, harmonizing at frequencies just below human hearing. Above it, a sphere of distorted space appeared, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and within that sphere, the normal rules of physics appeared to be suspended. Light bent at impossible angles. Gravity pointed sideways. Time seemed to flow at different rates. I could see dust motes caught in the sphere moving at different speeds depending on their position relative to the center. "This is a containment field," Haldor explained. "A technology your German visitors spent months trying to understand and years attempting to replicate with limited success. Within this field, we can manipulate fundamental forces, electromagnetism, gravity, nuclear forces, even the flow of time itself. Your most advanced weapons would be useless against beings who can create these fields at will." They showed us more. Crystalline aircraft that moved without visible propulsion, rising and maneuvering with the fluid grace of living creatures. Weapons that didn't fire projectiles, but instead created localized disruptions in space-time, causing targets to simply cease existing in this reality. Communication systems that operated faster than light, sending messages through dimensions our physics hadn't yet proven existed. Medical technologies that could regenerate lost limbs or cure diseases by directly manipulating cellular structure at the molecular level. Each demonstration was brief, clinical, designed not to impress but to educate, to make us understand the vast gulf between human technology circa 1947 and what the Ariani considered basic tools. "Your atomic weapons frighten you," Haldor said, deactivating the devices with gestures that looked like conducting an invisible orchestra. They should. But compared to what we possess, what we've preserved from our own civilization's peak, your nuclear arsenal is like a child playing with matches in a world that has already been consumed by fire. They led us deeper into the underground city, through streets that adjusted their layout as we walked, past buildings that seemed to grow and reshape themselves based on the needs of their inhabitants. We saw Ariani children, I assumed they were children, though they still stood over 6 feet tall, being educated through methods that involved direct neural interface with knowledge archives. We saw what might have been factories or research facilities where crystalline technologies were being grown rather than manufactured, shaped through processes that looked more like gardening than engineering. And everywhere we saw evidence of a civilization in decline, vast sections of the city that stood empty and dark, technologies that were being maintained but no longer developed, a population that had shrunk from billions to thousands and was clearly in the final stages of a long, graceful extinction. "We are dying," Haldor said simply, as we stood on a platform overlooking the city center where what might have been a government building or temple rose in spirals that hurt to look at directly. Not from disease or violence, but from cultural exhaustion. We have lived too long, learned too much, seen too many cycles of rise and fall. Our birth rate has declined to near zero over the past millennium. We maintain our technologies, but lack the will to advance them. We watch your surface world, but increasingly lack the energy to care about its trajectory. In perhaps another 1,000 years, the last of us will die, and Agartha will become truly dead, a tomb city filled with wonders that no one will remember or understand. He turned to face Admiral Byrd directly, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen in any human face. A weariness so profound it seemed to transcend individual experience and become a collective burden of an entire species. "That is why we permitted you to reach this place, Admiral. Not to threaten you or to demonstrate our superiority, but to deliver a warning from those who have already made the mistakes you are beginning to make. Your species stands at the same threshold we crossed 40,000 years ago. The choice you make now will determine whether humanity follows the path we took into slow extinction, or whether you can find a third option that neither we nor any previous civilization managed to achieve. And the clock is ticking, Admiral Byrd. The clock is ticking, and we fear you have far less time than you believe. Haldor gave us what he called freedom of the city, permission to explore Agartha under escort, to witness daily life in a civilization that existed in twilight, between magnificent past and inevitable extinction. Our guide was a younger Ariani female named Lyra, who spoke English with less of the archaic accent that characterized Haldor's speech, suggesting she'd learned from more recent observation of surface humans. She was perhaps 7 feet tall, with hair that seemed to shift between silver and gold, depending on the ambient light, and eyes that carried the same ancient intelligence as all her people, but with something that might have been curiosity rather than the weary resignation I'd seen in Haldor. Most of my people avoid contact with surface dwellers, she explained as she led us through streets that reorganized themselves around pedestrian traffic. They view your species as, how would you say it, a disappointing experiment. But I find your civilization fascinating precisely because it's making all the same mistakes we made, but compressed into a time frame of mere thousands of years, rather than the millions it took us to achieve similar technological sophistication. The city operated on principles that violated every assumption I'd made about how civilizations functioned. There was no money, no visible economy, no stores or markets where goods were exchanged. When I asked Lyra how the Ariani acquired necessities, she looked confused by the question, before explaining that the city itself provided for its inhabitants through technology that had been integrated into the infrastructure millennia ago. Matter replication, she called it, a process where devices throughout the city could scan an object's molecular structure and reproduce it from ambient atoms. She demonstrated by requesting what she called sustenance from a crystalline column that rose from the street, placing her hand on its surface and thinking about what she wanted, which materialized moments later in an alcove that opened in the structure. Your German visitors called this magic, she said, with something that might have been amusement. They spent weeks trying to understand it through their framework of science, and ultimately concluded it must involve some form of alchemy or occult practice. In reality, it's just advanced understanding of quantum mechanics and atomic manipulation. The architecture of Agartha was alive in ways that went beyond metaphor. The buildings weren't just constructed from responsive materials. They were semi-sentient organisms, crystalline life forms that had been shaped and programmed to serve as habitation and infrastructure. Lyra led us into one of the residential structures, and the interior reconfigured itself as we entered, growing furniture from the floor and walls, adjusting lighting and temperature based on our biological needs without any apparent input from its inhabitants. These structures were grown from seed crystals planted 40,000 years ago, Lyra explained, running her hand along a wall that pulsed with bioluminescence. They've been continuously adapting and evolving since then, learning from each generation of inhabitants and modifying themselves to serve their occupants better. Some of the older structures have achieved what we call architectural consciousness, a form of awareness that exists at the boundary between living organism and intelligent tool. We saw the education centers where young Ariani, though Lyra admitted there hadn't been a birth in Agartha for over 300 years, had once learned through direct neural interface with the city's knowledge archives. She demonstrated the process by placing a crystalline headset on Admiral Byrd, and I watched as his eyes went unfocused and tears started streaming down his face as information poured directly into his consciousness. When she removed the device after only 30 seconds, Byrd was shaking and needed Lieutenant Kearns and me to support him while he recovered. I saw, he started, his voice hoarse. I saw the entire history of this civilization from its origins to now. Millions of years compressed into seconds. the rise and fall of dozens of advanced species, the catastrophes that reshaped your world, the choices that led to this. He gestured at the empty education center, designed for hundreds of students, but now containing only us and our guide. I understand now why you're dying. You've seen too much, experienced too much. The weight of all that history, all that knowledge, it's crushing you. Lyra led us to what she called the Observatory of Surface Affairs, a chamber deep within the city's central structure where the Ariani monitored events in the world above. The walls were covered with displays showing real-time images from hundreds of locations around the globe, surveillance that had apparently been continuous for tens of thousands of years. I saw cities I recognized, New York, London, Moscow, alongside remote villages and wilderness areas, all being observed with the same detached clinical interest a biologist might use when studying ant colonies. "We have been watching your species since before you discovered agriculture," Lyra explained, manipulating controls that zoomed in on various locations with thought commands I couldn't detect. "We watched Sumer rise. We observed Egypt construct its pyramids. With some limited assistance from us, I'm ashamed to admit, a violation of our non-interference principles that we've regretted for millennia. We witnessed Rome's expansion and collapse. We saw the Dark Ages. We monitored your Renaissance and your Industrial Revolution. And now we watch as you develop atomic weapons and prepare to repeat the exact sequence of events that destroyed the previous surface civilizations." I.e., the historical archives they showed us were more comprehensive and accurate than any record humanity had preserved. They had detailed documentation of civilizations that official history claimed were myths. Atlantis had been real, a technologically advanced civilization that achieved nuclear fission and destroyed itself in a war with another advanced culture the Ariani called Lemuria. Mu, the lost continent of the Pacific, had existed and had been home to a civilization that had achieved limited spaceflight before internal conflicts turned their orbital weapons against their own cities. The biblical flood hadn't been divine punishment, but the consequence of advanced weapons, destabilizing polar ice caps and raising sea levels by hundreds of feet in a matter of decades. "Every culture's mythology contains fragments of truth," Lyra said, showing us images of events that had been recorded as divine intervention or supernatural occurrence, but were actually advanced technology being deployed by species that surface humanity had forgotten. Your stories of angels and demons, gods walking among mortals, sky chariots and heavenly cities, most of these are distorted memories of previous civilizations and their technologies, passed down through countless generations and transformed by the limitations of primitive language, trying to describe concepts it had no framework to understand. We were shown the records of Ariani contact attempts throughout human history. Carefully orchestrated interventions designed to guide human development toward more sustainable paths, all of which had ended in failure or unintended consequences. They'd given knowledge of astronomy to ancient Sumerians, hoping to inspire humanity toward space exploration as an alternative to earthbound conflicts. The Sumerians had used that knowledge to develop astrological systems that reinforced fatalistic belief systems. They'd shared mathematical principles with Greek philosophers, hoping to accelerate scientific development. The knowledge had been co-opted by mystery cults and hidden behind layers of secrecy and initiation. They'd attempted to share principles of renewable energy with inventors during the early Industrial Revolution. The inventors had been discredited, assassinated, or bought out by interests that profited from fossil fuel dependence. "We stopped trying to help after your World War I, Lyra said, her voice carrying genuine sadness. "We realized that direct intervention only accelerated your technological development without providing corresponding advancement in wisdom or ethics. You would get the tools before understanding their implications, and the results were inevitably catastrophic." The biological archives were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what we witnessed. The Ariane hadn't just been watching human civilization, they'd been studying human biology, genetics, evolution. They had samples of human DNA dating back over 50,000 years, genetic information that allowed them to track our species' development with scientific precision. And what they'd discovered was deeply troubling. Humanity wasn't a purely natural evolutionary development. Our genetic code showed evidence of modification, deliberate manipulation at some point in our distant past. We believe, Lyra explained, showing us complex genetic sequences that meant nothing to me, but made Admiral Byrd's face go pale, that human beings were engineered by a previous advanced civilization, possibly as a slave race or servant species. Your unusual combination of intelligence and aggression, your capacity for both profound creativity and senseless violence, your ability to dominate your environment while destroying it, these aren't typical evolutionary traits. They're the result of design, of intentional genetic modification, performed tens of thousands of years ago by beings whose motivations we can only speculate about. Marie. We visited the medical facilities, where Ariane technology could diagnose and treat diseases that humanity hadn't even discovered yet. Lyra demonstrated by scanning Lieutenant Kearns with a device that looked like a crystalline wand, which immediately reported that he had early-stage lung cancer, something he hadn't known about and wouldn't have discovered until years later using 1947 medical technology. The device not only detected the cancer, but offered to cure it through a treatment process that would take approximately 10 minutes and would involve directly manipulating the cellular structure of the affected tissue at a molecular level. Kearns refused the treatment. I think he was too overwhelmed by everything we'd witnessed to accept the reality of what he was being offered. But the demonstration proved that the Ariane possessed medical knowledge that could save millions of human lives. "We could cure every disease your species suffers from," Lyra said quietly. "We could extend human lifespan by centuries. We could eliminate genetic disorders and repair damage that your medicine considers permanent. But we won't, because knowledge given is knowledge misunderstood. And technology provided without the wisdom to use it responsibly becomes a weapon rather than a tool." The city's central archive was where the Ariane preserved their most dangerous knowledge, the technologies and discoveries that had led to their civilization's near extinction and the destruction of previous surface civilizations. Haldor met us there, in a chamber whose walls displayed equations and diagrams that hurt to look at directly, as if the information itself was too dense for human consciousness to process safely. "This is what the Germans sought," he explained, gesturing at knowledge archives that contained principles of physics that could revolutionize or destroy human civilization. They found fragmentary information, partial understanding of technologies they interpreted through their ideology of conquest and domination. They learned enough to develop jet aircraft, rocket propulsion, and early atomic research decades before your other nations achieved similar capabilities. Had the war continued another year, they would have developed weapons that would have made their defeat impossible and their victory catastrophic for all humanity. As we prepared to leave the archive, Lyra gave us what she called a final gift of perspective, access to a viewing device that showed possible futures based on current trajectories. I saw multiple scenarios of Earth's next few decades, probability branches that diverged based on decisions that hadn't been made yet. Some showed humanity surviving and advancing, developing space travel and establishing colonies on other worlds, eventually achieving the wisdom necessary to join what Lyra called the community of advanced species. But most of the scenarios showed variations of catastrophe, nuclear wars that reduced the surface world to radioactive wasteland, environmental collapse that made Earth uninhabitable, technological singularities that destroyed humanity while trying to save it. And in every scenario, The Ariani watched from their underground sanctuaries, documenting humanity's end with the same clinical detachment they'd used to document our rise. "We cannot save you," Haldor said, his voice heavy with the finality of absolute truth. "We can only witness, document, and hope that the next intelligent species to evolve on this planet learns from the mistakes that every previous one has made. The question, Admiral Byrd, is whether your species can save itself. Whether humanity possesses the wisdom to step back from the precipice before momentum carries you over the edge into extinction. And based on everything we've observed over 40,000 years of watching intelligent species rise and fall, we are not optimistic." The Council of Elders convened in a chamber that felt less like a meeting room and more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of knowledge and regret. 7 Ariani, who appeared even older than Haldor, if age could be measured by the weight of accumulated grief visible in their eyes rather than physical deterioration, sat in a semicircle on seats that grew from the floor as we entered. The chamber's walls displayed a constant stream of images from the surface world, millions of data points flowing past in patterns that suggested these beings were processing information at rates far beyond human cognitive capacity. Admiral Byrd, Lieutenant Kearns, and I stood before them, like students called before a disciplinary board. Except this board had been observing humanity for 40,000 years and had already reached conclusions about our species that we probably wouldn't like. The eldest among them, a female whose hair had gone completely white and whose eyes held such profound sadness that meeting her gaze felt like drowning, spoke first. "We are Elysia," she said, using the plural in a way that suggested she spoke for all 7. "We are the memory of what was, and the guardians of what must never be again." What they showed us next was footage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not from human cameras or government archives. The Ariani had been watching on August 6th and 9th, 1945, recording with instruments that captured not just visual information, but radiation levels, molecular displacement patterns, the quantum disruption caused by nuclear fission, and, most disturbingly, what Elysia called consciousness displacement vectors, measurements of the exact moment when hundreds of thousands of human souls cease to exist in measurable reality. The images were more detailed and more horrifying than any propaganda film or documentary footage I'd seen. I watched human bodies vaporize in microseconds, leaving shadows burned into concrete. I saw buildings atomize into component molecules. I witnessed the shockwave propagate through the city, killing efficiently and completely, erasing in seconds what had taken generations to build. But what made the Ariani footage truly unbearable was that it included perspectives from inside the blast radius. Reconstructed viewpoints of what the victims experienced in their final moments. Simulations so accurate it felt like I was dying alongside them. Admiral Byrd vomited. I'm not ashamed to admit that I did too. We stood in an alien chamber beneath Antarctic ice, watching replay after replay of American weapons incinerating Japanese civilians, and the clinical precision of the Ariani documentation made it impossible to maintain the psychological distance that allowed soldiers to justify their actions during wartime. Elysia let us watch for what felt like hours, though time seemed elastic in that chamber, moments stretching or compressing based on the weight of what we were witnessing. When she finally stopped the playback, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like gunfire. "This," she said, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested even 40,000 years of observed catastrophes hadn't prepared her people for the efficiency of human cruelty, "is why we permitted you to reach Agartha. This is the threshold that no previous civilization has crossed without triggering the sequence of events that led to total annihilation." The Council showed us comparative footage from the catastrophe that had destroyed the previous surface civilizations 12,000 years earlier. The weapons used then had been more sophisticated than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. quantum destabilization devices that didn't just release energy, but actually rewrote the fundamental forces holding matter together within targeted areas. Cities hadn't just been destroyed, they'd been unmade, their component atoms scattered across dimensional boundaries that the Ariane still couldn't fully map. And the process hadn't stopped with the initial targets. The weapons had created cascading failures in reality itself, spreading destruction like a virus until entire continents were consumed and the planet's magnetic field destabilized to the point where extinction-level events became inevitable. "Your atomic weapons are crude by comparison," Alicia explained, calling up images that showed the mathematical progression from Hiroshima-level destruction to planetary annihilation. But they are crude in the way that early firearms were crude compared to modern artillery. The progression is inevitable, the destination certain, unless the trajectory is altered before momentum becomes unstoppable. Though they showed us classified footage that they'd somehow obtained from American, Soviet, British, and other government archives. Footage that shouldn't have existed outside the most secure military facilities on Earth. Tests of hydrogen bomb designs that were thousands of times more powerful than the weapons used on Japan. Blueprints for intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads anywhere on the planet within 30 minutes. Plans for submarine-launched weapons that would make retaliation against a first strike virtually guaranteed. Strategic doctrine documents that discussed acceptable losses in the millions and outlined scenarios for surviving nuclear exchange by sacrificing most of the civilian population. "Your governments are already planning for the war that will end your civilization," Alicia said, her voice hardening with something that might have been anger if the Ariane weren't too evolved for such primitive emotions. "They are developing weapons they know will cause unprecedented destruction, justifying their development by claiming they will prevent war through deterrence, repeating exactly the same logic that every previous civilization used before destroying itself." Admiral Byrd finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. "What do you want from us? Why show us this if you won't help, if you've already decided that we're doomed to repeat history?" The seven elders looked at each other, communicating through methods I couldn't detect, before Alicia responded with words that had clearly been prepared and rehearsed, but carried weight that made them feel spontaneous. "We want you to deliver a message to your leaders, Admiral Byrd. We want you to tell the men who control your weapons and shape your policies that they are being watched by a civilization that has already made the mistakes they are planning to make. We want you to warn them that if they continue developing and deploying nuclear weapons, if they allow international tensions to escalate toward the kind of conflict that would employ those weapons, we will intervene." The threat wasn't delivered with malice or hostility, just absolute certainty that made it more terrifying than any overt aggression could have been. Alicia manipulated controls that caused the chamber walls to display a map of Earth's major cities, military installations, and centers of government. "We have the capability to neutralize your nuclear arsenals remotely," she explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone describing technical specifications rather than issuing ultimatums. "We can render your atomic weapons inert, disable your delivery systems, destroy your production facilities without harming surrounding populations. We've been observing your weapons development for decades, studying your designs and identifying the critical components that would need to be disrupted to prevent their use. If necessary, we can set your civilization's technological development back 50 years overnight, forcing you to rebuild from a level where nuclear weapons are beyond your capacity to construct." But that wasn't the full extent of their threat. The elders showed us capabilities that made remote weapon disablement look merciful by comparison. They demonstrated, not with actual deployment but through simulations so detailed it felt real, the ability to trigger localized electromagnetic pulses that would destroy all electronic systems within radius of hundreds of miles effectively ending modern industrial civilization in affected areas. They showed us climate modification technologies that could cause or prevent ice ages, alter ocean currents to make entire regions uninhabitable, or shift weather patterns to create droughts or floods that would devastate agricultural production. They revealed surveillance capabilities that made our most advanced reconnaissance equipment look like children's toys, sensors that could track every nuclear weapon on Earth in real time and predict their deployment before launch orders were given. "We are not threatening you out of malice," Elysia said, her expression showing the kind of sorrow that comes from being forced into positions you never wanted to occupy. "We are warning you, because we've watched too many civilizations reach this point and fail to turn back. We've documented too many worlds reduced to radioactive rubble because intelligence evolved faster than wisdom. We will not allow you to destroy this planet just because you lack the maturity to control technologies you don't fully understand." The ultimatum was delivered with precision that made it clear this wasn't negotiable or subject to discussion. If humanity engaged in nuclear warfare, any nuclear warfare, even limited exchange between minor powers, the Ariane would intervene immediately and completely. They would disable every nuclear weapon on Earth, destroy every facility capable of producing such weapons, and eliminate the knowledge necessary to reconstruct them by whatever means necessary, including direct mental manipulation of scientists and engineers who possessed critical information. "We have the capability to edit human memory on a massive scale," Elysia explained, showing brain scan technology that made our most advanced neurology look like phrenology. "We can identify specific memories and remove them, replace them with alternatives, or simply erase them entirely. If you force us to intervene through nuclear deployment, we will ensure that your species forgets how to construct atomic weapons. You will remember that such weapons existed, remember that they were used, but you will lack the specific knowledge required to rebuild them. And we will continue monitoring your civilization to prevent rediscovery of that knowledge for as long as necessary." But the intervention would come at a cost that made the threat feel less like salvation and more like a different form of catastrophe. The Ariane explained that large-scale memory modification wasn't surgical. It couldn't be perfectly targeted to affect only weapons scientists while leaving everyone else untouched. The knowledge they'd need to erase was distributed across millions of people: engineers, technicians, military personnel, political leaders, even civilians who'd studied nuclear physics in university. Removing that knowledge would have cascading effects on other areas of human civilization, disrupting industries and technologies that depended on principles related to nuclear fission. "We estimate," Elysia said quietly, her voice carrying genuine regret, "that intervention on this scale would reduce global human population by approximately 30 to 40% through indirect effects. Starvation caused by disrupted agricultural systems, medical crises from lost pharmaceutical knowledge, infrastructure collapse from missing technical expertise. We would save you from immediate nuclear annihilation by inflicting a slower catastrophe that would still kill billions. But you would survive as a species, which is more than can be said for any civilization that has employed weapons of mass destruction against itself." Admiral Byrd was pale as death, his hands shaking as he tried to process the implications of what we were being told. "You're saying that if we use nuclear weapons, you'll essentially lobotomize human civilization, set us back decades or centuries in our development?" Elysia's expression remained neutral, but I saw something flicker in the eyes of the other elders. Perhaps disagreement with the policy they were articulating, or maybe just exhaustion with the debate they'd been having among themselves for years. "We're saying that we'll do whatever is necessary to prevent this planet from becoming another dead world," she replied. "Earth has survived 4 previous extinction events caused by intelligent species that achieved technological sophistication without corresponding wisdom. The planet will recover eventually. Life is resilient, evolution is patient, and in another million years, new species will arise that might succeed where you failed. But we'd prefer not to wait another million years. We'd prefer that humanity learns from our warnings and chooses a different path. The final component of their warning was perhaps the most disturbing, because it came with evidence rather than just threats. The Ariani showed us documentation of other attempts at intervention they'd made throughout human history, subtle manipulations of events designed to prevent or mitigate conflicts that might have escalated toward nuclear deployment. They'd been involved, they claimed, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, causing technical failures on both American and Soviet sides that had prevented launch orders from being executed during the most dangerous moments of that confrontation. They'd interfered with Chinese nuclear tests that had been planned for populated areas, causing weather patterns that forced postponement until safer testing protocols could be established. They'd even eliminated, through methods they declined to specify, several key military and political figures who'd been advocating for preemptive nuclear strikes against perceived enemies. "We've already been intervening," Elysia admitted, "covertly, carefully, trying to guide your species away from extinction without revealing our presence. But our subtle methods are becoming insufficient as your weapons proliferate and your political tensions escalate. The message we need you to deliver, Admiral Byrd, is that if subtle intervention continues to fail, we will resort to methods that are considerably less subtle." As the council meeting concluded and we were escorted from the chamber, I found myself wondering whether the Ariani threat of intervention was actually a gift rather than a punishment. If they could prevent nuclear war, if they could save humanity from destroying itself, even if the cost was a temporary setback in our technological development, wasn't that preferable to the alternative? But then I remembered the footage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the clinical documentation of hundreds of thousands dying in seconds, and I realized that the Ariani weren't offering to save us. They were offering to prevent us from becoming the thing we were most afraid of, a species that destroyed itself through weapons it had created but lacked the wisdom to control. They were offering to take away our ability to commit suicide, but the price would be losing the autonomy to make our own decisions, even catastrophically wrong ones. As we walked back through the impossible city toward the valley where our aircraft waited, Admiral Byrd finally broke the silence. "They've given us an impossible task," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell our leaders that we're being watched by a superior civilization that will intervene if we use nuclear weapons. They'll either think I'm insane, or they'll want to find and neutralize the threat. Either way, the message won't achieve what the Ariani hope it will achieve. We're going to keep building weapons. We're going to keep preparing for war. And when the time comes, when tensions escalate past the point of no return, those weapons will be used regardless of what ancient beings hiding under Antarctica claim they'll do to stop us." Our departure from Agartha felt less like leaving and more like being expelled from a place that had tolerated our presence but never truly welcomed it. The Ariani returned us to our aircraft with an efficiency that suggested they were eager to see us gone, and within hours of saying goodbye to Haldor and Lyra, we were airborne again, flying back across the impossible valley toward the ice shelf where our fleet waited. But something had changed. The warm, temperate climate we'd flown through on our way to Agartha had turned hostile. Winds that buffeted our aircraft with violence that felt deliberate, clouds that seemed to track our movement and pulse with internal lightning, and an atmospheric pressure that made our instruments go haywire and our engines labor like they were trying to fly through molasses. "They're not making this easy," Admiral Byrd muttered, fighting with controls that responded sluggishly to his inputs. "Either the Ariani are angry we're leaving with knowledge they'd prefer stayed hidden, or something else down here doesn't want us reporting what we've seen." We emerged from the valley into Antarctic winter darkness, And that's when I saw them for the first time in conditions where there could be no doubt about what I was witnessing. Objects in the sky that moved with purpose and intelligence, disc-shaped craft that glowed with the same bioluminescent patterns I'd seen throughout Agartha, pacing our aircraft at distances that varied from a few hundred yards to several miles. There were at least 9 of them, possibly more, difficult to count because they kept disappearing from view only to reappear in different positions seconds later, as if they were jumping through space rather than traveling through it. "Contact Mount Olympus," Byrd ordered Lieutenant Kearns. "Tell them we have visual contact with unidentified aerial phenomena and request immediate fighter escort." But when Kearns tried the radio, all he got was static filled with sounds that might have been voices, speaking in frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. The attack, when it came, wasn't preceded by warning or provocation. It was sudden, overwhelming, and so precisely coordinated that it suggested military action rather than random aggression. The discs accelerated to speeds that made them appear as streaks of light, positioning themselves around our aircraft in a formation that looked almost ceremonial before unleashing energy weapons that I'd only seen demonstrated in Ariane simulations. Beams of coherent light, not lasers as I understood them, but something that made the air itself glow and vibrate, struck our port engine with surgical precision, causing systems to fail without creating the explosive damage that conventional weapons would have caused. We didn't catch fire or break apart. We just lost power, as if something had reached into our engine and simply turned it off at a molecular level. Byrd fought to maintain altitude on one engine, while Kearns sent distress signals that were probably being received, but couldn't be responded to because, as we learned later, every aircraft in our fleet was under simultaneous attack. Through the cockpit windows, I watched the sky over the Ross ice shelf transform into a battlefield that looked more like science fiction than military engagement. Disc-shaped craft, dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, swarming from locations that our reconnaissance flights had never detected, were engaging every aircraft in Operation Highjump's arsenal. Our fighter planes, P-51 Mustangs and F-4U Corsairs that had dominated Pacific skies during the war, were being swatted from the air like insects, their weapons fire passing through the discs without apparent effect, while return fire disabled their systems with the same precise, non-explosive methodology that had crippled our aircraft. I saw a Mariner seaplane try to make an emergency water landing, only to have one of the discs position itself directly above the water's surface, creating some kind of field that froze the ocean solid in seconds, turning potential safe landing into lethal impact against ice that shouldn't have formed so quickly. We managed to crash land on the ice shelf through a combination of Admiral Byrd's skill and what might have been mercy from our attackers. They'd disabled our engines, but hadn't destroyed our aircraft, suggesting they wanted us grounded rather than dead. The impact was brutal, throwing us against our harnesses hard enough that I heard Lieutenant Kearns' collarbone snap and felt something tear in my own shoulder. But we survived, and when I looked through the cracked cockpit window, I saw that the discs had stopped their attack and were now hovering at various altitudes around the fleet, watching with the same clinical interest that the Ariane had shown when observing surface humanity. The message was clear. They could have destroyed us completely, reduced Operation Highjump to debris and bodies scattered across Antarctic ice, but they'd chosen restraint. This was a demonstration, not an extermination. The damage assessment came in over the following hours as our crippled fleet regrouped and tried to make sense of what had happened. We'd lost 6 aircraft completely, 3 fighters and 3 reconnaissance planes that had either crashed during the attack or been hit with weapons that caused them to simply disintegrate mid-flight, their molecules scattered across the Antarctic sky like dust. 13 more aircraft were damaged beyond field repair, including our own, which meant they'd have to be abandoned or destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Though what enemy we were supposed to be protecting our technology from was now a question with disturbing implications. 2 of our ships had been damaged, not sunk, but their electronic systems fried by electromagnetic pulses that the discs had deployed with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of our vessel's vulnerabilities. We'd lost 23 personnel, some from crashes, others from exposure when they'd been forced to abandon aircraft in conditions where survival time was measured in minutes. Admiral Byrd called an emergency meeting of senior officers aboard the Mount Olympus, and I was included despite my junior rank because I was one of the few people who'd witnessed both Agartha and the aerial attack. The mood in the wardroom was beyond grim. We'd just been defeated in an engagement with a force that our training had never prepared us to fight, using technology that made our most advanced weapons look like museum pieces. "We need to discuss our options," the fleet commander said, though his tone made it clear he believed our options were extremely limited. Continue the mission as planned, establish a permanent base and conduct long-term exploration, or abort Operation Highjump and return to base with a full report of what we've encountered. The debate that followed was heated, with some officers arguing for pressing forward despite the attack, claiming that retreat would embolden whatever force had attacked us. But Admiral Byrd, who'd been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke with authority that ended all discussion. "We're leaving," he said, his voice carrying weight that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "We're leaving because we've learned what we came to learn, and staying longer will only result in more casualties without providing additional useful information. What attacked us wasn't Nazi remnants or Soviet infiltrators. It was technology controlled by the beings I met in Agartha, and they were sending a message. You've been warned, you've been shown what we're capable of, and if you ignore our warnings, we'll demonstrate those capabilities on a scale that will make today's attack look like a training exercise." He pulled out his journal, the leather notebook that contained his documentation of everything we'd witnessed, and I saw that his hands were shaking. "I need to get this information to Washington, to the President, to anyone with the authority and courage to understand that we're not alone on this planet, that we're being observed by intelligence that could crush our civilization without effort, and that our development of atomic weapons has triggered a countdown that will end, either with humanity developing wisdom sufficient to control our destructive capabilities, or with intervention that will set our species back generations." Indeed, the withdrawal from Antarctica was chaos organized through decades of naval training and professionalism that kept men functioning even when everything they'd been taught about reality had just been proven wrong. We abandoned millions of dollars worth of equipment, scuttled damaged ships that couldn't make the return journey, and consolidated our forces onto vessels that were still operational. The discs watched the entire process, hovering at altitudes where they were visible to everyone, but remaining just out of range of our weapons. Not that anyone was stupid enough to fire on them after what we'd witnessed. They followed us as we departed Antarctic waters, maintaining formation around our fleet like escort vessels, and only disappeared once we crossed back above the Antarctic Circle, vanishing with the same instantaneous displacement that characterized all their movements. The message couldn't have been clearer. They were letting us leave, but they were also making sure we understood that we left on their terms, not ours. The official story, the version that would be released to newspapers and entered into naval records, bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened. Operation Highjump, according to official accounts, was terminated early due to unusually harsh weather conditions and equipment failures that made continued operations unsafe. And the losses we'd sustained were attributed to training accidents and natural hazards inherent to Antarctic exploration. Admiral Byrd's planned 8-month expedition ended after barely 8 weeks, and the fact that we'd assembled the largest polar fleet in history only to turn around and flee after minimal exploration raised questions that the Navy worked hard to discourage. Reporters who pressed for details about what we'd found were told that all mission specifics were classified for national security reasons. Crew members who talked about seeing strange aircraft or encountering impossible technology were quietly discharged or transferred to remote postings where their stories would be dismissed as tall tales. But the real debriefing, the one that happened in windowless rooms in Washington with audiences that included military intelligence, CIA, and people whose agencies didn't have official names, was where the truth was documented and then systematically classified at levels above presidential authorization. Admiral Byrd presented his journal, the photographs we'd managed to take, Lieutenant Kearns's testimony about the technology we'd witnessed, and my own accounts of everything we'd seen in Agartha. The reaction wasn't shock or disbelief. It was grim confirmation of suspicions that apparently had been developing since the first atomic bomb detonation. "We've been receiving reports of increased UFO activity since Hiroshima," one intelligence officer explained during a break in our debriefing. "Sightings near military installations, especially nuclear facilities. Objects that demonstrate flight characteristics beyond known technology. We suspected we'd attracted attention from something, but we didn't know from what or from where. Your discovery of Agartha provides context for what we've been observing. We're not being visited by beings from other planets. We're being monitored by a civilization that's been here all along, living under our feet, watching us develop weapons that could destroy the planet they've been protecting for 40,000 years." The final briefing with Admiral Byrd happened in a private meeting. Just him and me, and two men who never introduced themselves, but carried themselves with the kind of authority that suggested they made decisions that presidents would implement without question. "You understand," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless, "that everything you witnessed in Antarctica constitutes a national security secret of the highest classification. You will not discuss what you saw with anyone. Not family, not friends, not future colleagues, not therapists if you develop PTSD from your experiences. The penalties for violation of this secrecy are severe and will be enforced without mercy or exception. We're not threatening you, Lieutenant Caldwell. We're explaining the reality of your situation. You possess knowledge that could cause mass panic if released publicly. Knowledge that would be disbelieved by most people but would raise extremely dangerous questions among those who took it seriously. You will maintain silence for the rest of your life, or you will be silenced permanently. Do you understand?" I understood. I understood that I'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, shown truths that most of humanity would never know, and that the price of that knowledge was isolation, paranoia, and the burden of carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. The debriefing process began the moment our ship docked in Norfolk, and it wouldn't truly end for the rest of my life. Men in dark suits were waiting on the pier before we'd even finished securing the lines, and they separated Admiral Byrd, Lieutenant Kearns, and me from the rest of the crew with efficiency that suggested they'd been planning this operation since before we left Antarctica. We were escorted, not arrested. They were very careful about that distinction, to unmarked vehicles with government plates and driven to a facility that officially didn't exist on any map or organizational chart. No windows, no identification on the guards, no paperwork acknowledging that we were being held in what was functionally military detention, despite the polite fiction that we were consulting with intelligence services regarding mission outcomes. For 3 days, we were interrogated separately, each of us telling our story dozens of times to rotating teams of debriefers who took notes in shorthand and recorded everything on wire machines that would later be transcribed, classified, and buried in archives that wouldn't be opened for decades, if ever. They started with the easy questions: timeline of events, descriptions of locations, technical specifications of the aircraft and equipment we'd observed. These were establishing baseline credibility, confirming that we were reliable witnesses who could distinguish between what we'd actually seen and what trauma or exhaustion might have made us imagine. But then the questions got harder, more specific, probing for details that I didn't realize were significant until I was asked about them. They wanted to know exact numbers, how many Ariani we'd encountered, what their population looked like in terms of age distribution and gender ratio, whether we'd seen any military infrastructure beyond the defensive capabilities they'd demonstrated during our departure. They wanted descriptions of the technology, not just what it looked like, but how it functioned, what theoretical principles it might operate on, whether there were any components that looked like they could be reverse engineered with current human scientific understanding. And they wanted to assess the threat level. Were the Ariani capable of offensive action beyond Antarctic regions? Could they deploy their technology globally? What were the chances they'd intervene in human affairs beyond the warnings they delivered? Admiral Byrd's interrogation was apparently more intense than mine, though I didn't learn the details until years later. They were particularly interested in his journal, which they confiscated immediately and classified at levels that made the Manhattan Project look like public information. Byrd fought to keep it, argued that his documentation was crucial evidence that needed to be preserved and analyzed, but they explained with bureaucratic certainty that his notes were now property of the United States government, and that any copies he might have made would also need to be surrendered. When he refused to confirm or deny having made copies, they searched his personal effects, his home, his office at the Navy Department, and the homes of every family member he'd been in contact with since returning from Antarctica. They found 2 copies he'd hidden, which gave them confidence there weren't others, though I knew for a fact, because he told me decades later, right before he died, that he'd secreted a 3rd copy in a location they never discovered. The psychological evaluation was worse than the interrogation. They brought in psychiatrists and specialists in what they called extreme experience processing, who wanted to determine whether witnessing Agatha and the Ariani had caused permanent psychological damage that would make us unreliable or potentially dangerous. They used tests that I later learned had been developed for studying soldiers who'd experienced severe combat trauma, asking questions designed to reveal whether we'd developed delusional thinking or breaks with reality. The implication was clear. If they decided we were mentally unstable, our testimony could be dismissed as trauma-induced psychosis, and we could be institutionalized indefinitely for our own protection and national security. I learned to give the right answers, to describe what I'd seen in clinical terms that suggested I was processing the experience rationally rather than being overwhelmed by it. But inside, I was terrified that I was going insane, that the impossible things I'd witnessed had broken something fundamental in my understanding of reality that would never fully heal. The threats came on the 4th day, delivered by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Gray, almost certainly not his real name, who represented what he vaguely described as coordination services between military and civilian intelligence agencies. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of face that you forgot immediately after meeting, and he spoke in a monotone that made even the most dramatic statements sound routine. "Lieutenant Caldwell," he began, reading from a file that apparently contained my entire life history. "You've been exposed to information that constitutes a clear and present danger to national security. Not because the information itself is inherently dangerous, but because its premature release to the public would cause social instability on a scale that could threaten the survival of American democratic institutions. People are not prepared to learn that we share the planet with non-human intelligence, that our technological achievements are primitive compared to civilizations that predate recorded history, and that our continued existence may depend on the benevolence of beings who view us as evolutionary failures. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I understood. I understood that I was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Maintain absolute silence about everything I'd witnessed in Antarctica, or be classified as a security risk and dealt with accordingly. Mr. Gray didn't explicitly threaten my life. That would have been crude and possibly actionable if I ever managed to testify about this conversation. But he made the parameters of my future very clear. I would be allowed to return to civilian life with an honorable discharge and a modest pension that would be contingent on my continued cooperation with security protocols. I would submit to periodic monitoring to ensure I wasn't attempting to share classified information. I would notify designated contacts before traveling internationally or associating with journalists, academics, or anyone else who might be interested in unusual claims about Antarctic exploration. And I would understand that any violation of these conditions would result in immediate revocation of all benefits, potential criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act, and possible involuntary commitment to psychiatric facilities for evaluation periods that could extend indefinitely. The documents I signed that day essentially surrendered every right I had as an American citizen. Non-disclosure agreements that covered not just the classified aspects of Operation Highjump, but any future information I might acquire about related topics. Acknowledgement that I understood the penalties for security violations and agreed to accept them without appeal or judicial review. Consent for ongoing surveillance of my communications and activities, waiving normal protections against unreasonable search and seizure. And most disturbingly, a document granting the government authority to take preventive action if I was deemed at risk of compromising classified information, even if no actual violation had occurred, essentially giving them legal cover to silence me permanently if they decided I was becoming unreliable. These documents are for your protection as much as ours, Mr. Gray explained with a sincerity that made the lie even more insulting. If you maintain silence and live a normal life, you'll never hear from us again. But if you deviate from expected patterns, if you start making claims that could be construed as revealing classified information, we'll intervene before you can do serious damage to yourself or national security. The surveillance started immediately and continued for 77 years, though its intensity varied based on factors I never fully understood. Sometimes it was obvious. Cars parked across from my apartment with occupants who made no effort to conceal that they were watching. Phone calls where I could hear the click of recording equipment engaging. Mail that arrived, opened, and clumsily resealed. Other times it was subtle enough that I could almost convince myself I was paranoid, that the coincidences were actually coincidences rather than evidence of monitoring. But there were too many patterns to dismiss. Job interviews that went well until background checks revealed my naval service, relationships that ended abruptly after my girlfriends reported being contacted by people asking questions about my mental health, professional opportunities that evaporated without explanation right when they seemed most promising. They weren't just watching me. They were managing my life, ensuring I remained isolated, underemployed, and lacking the credibility or resources that would be necessary to make my testimony dangerous. Admiral Byrd's fate was different, but no less controlled. They couldn't hide him the way they could hide a 21-year-old junior officer nobody had heard of. So instead, they managed his public persona with precision that turned him into a monument to exploration while ensuring his most important discoveries remained classified. He gave lectures about Antarctica that carefully omitted everything significant we'd found, wrote books that described the ice and the isolation without mentioning underground civilizations or advanced technology, and appeared at public events where he smiled and told sanitized versions of Operation Highjump that bore no resemblance to what actually happened. I saw him a few times over the years, carefully orchestrated meetings that were certainly monitored, and each time he looked more hollowed out, as if the burden of maintaining the lie was consuming him from inside. The last time I saw him in 1956, he looked like a ghost wearing Admiral Byrd's face. He died the following year, officially of heart failure, though I've always wondered if hearts fail on their own, or if sometimes they get help when the person who owns them becomes more liability than asset. The paranoia became part of my personality, a permanent alteration in how I processed reality and interacted with the world. I learned to assume that every phone conversation was monitored, every letter opened and copied before delivery, every person who showed unusual interest in my past, potentially an intelligence operative, testing my willingness to maintain silence. I developed elaborate protocols for moving through public spaces, checking for surveillance, and varying my routes with techniques I'd learned during military training. I kept minimal documentation of my own life, never maintaining journals or diaries that could reveal my thoughts about Antarctica, never taking photographs that might accidentally capture something suspicious that would give them excuse to increase monitoring. And I learned to exist in two states simultaneously: the public Jimmy Caldwell, who smiled and pretended everything was normal, and the private Jimmy Caldwell who carried secrets that grew heavier with each passing year until they felt like they were crushing my spine. The isolation was the worst part of the cover-up, worse than the surveillance or the threats or the knowledge that I could be disappeared at any moment if I became inconvenient. I couldn't share the most significant experience of my life with anyone, not my mother, who died thinking her son had just done routine Antarctic exploration, not my sister, who knew I'd changed after coming home but could never understand why, not the women I dated, who couldn't comprehend the distance I maintained or the secrets I carried. I watched documentaries about Antarctica and had to keep silent when they repeated the official lies about Operation Highjump. I read books about UFO sightings that described the exact kinds of craft I'd seen attacking our fleet, and I couldn't confirm or validate the accounts of witnesses who were being dismissed as cranks. I listened to conspiracy theorists get tantalizingly close to the truth about underground civilizations and advanced pre-human technology, and I had to remain silent while they were ridiculed and discredited. The times I almost broke were the hardest to endure. In 1952, when I contacted that reporter for the Washington Post, and he died in a convenient car accident. In 1968, when I wrote the manuscript that burned along with my house in a fire attributed to faulty wiring I'd just had replaced. In 1989, when I tried to approach a documentary filmmaker who committed suicide before we could have our second meeting. Each attempt to break silence was met with response that made it clear I was being watched more closely than I'd realized, that the surveillance had never stopped or diminished, that they were always there in the shadows waiting for me to violate the agreements I'd signed. And each failure to share the truth reinforced the isolation, made me more certain that I would die with these secrets still locked in my head. Knowledge that could change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe, dying with one old man who'd been successfully silenced for 8 decades. The worst part was watching the world move toward exactly the catastrophe the Ariane had warned us about. I saw the nuclear arms race accelerate through the 1950s and 60s, watched the Cuban Missile Crisis bring us within hours of the kind of exchange that would have triggered Ariane intervention, witnessed the proliferation of atomic weapons to more and more nations despite everything we'd been told about what that proliferation would mean. Admiral Byrd had delivered his message to the highest levels of government, had shown them evidence of what we'd discovered and warnings we'd been given, and they'd classified it all and continued building weapons anyway. They'd decided that the risk of Ariane intervention was preferable to the perceived risk of unilateral disarmament, that maintaining strategic parity with the Soviet Union was more important than heeding warnings from a civilization that had already survived the catastrophe we were racing toward. And I couldn't say anything, couldn't warn anyone, couldn't even write an anonymous letter without triggering surveillance protocols that would identify me and lead to consequences I'd been threatened with for decades. The morphine isn't working anymore. Or maybe I've just gotten too old for chemical relief to reach the places where the real pain lives. It's October 2024, and I'm 98 years old, and the cancer that started in my pancreas has spread to everywhere that matters. The hospice nurses are kind, but they don't understand why I keep refusing to let them increase my dosage to levels that would let me sleep peacefully through these final days. I need to stay conscious. I need to stay lucid long enough to finish this recording and reveal the location of evidence I've hidden for 77 years. Evidence that proves everything I've told you isn't the delusions of a dying mind, but documented truth that multiple governments have worked to suppress since 1947. The men who've been watching me for 8 decades know I'm dying. I can see their car parked across from the hospice, same black sedan that's followed me through 12 different cities and 40 different addresses. They're waiting to see if I'll try one last time to break silence before I die, and they're ready to intervene if necessary. But they're too late. This recording is already uploaded, already distributed to locations they'll never find, and the evidence I'm about to reveal has been hidden in a place they never thought to search. Admiral Byrd gave me the 3rd copy of his journal 3 days before he died in March 1957. I visited him in the hospital where he was recovering from what doctors publicly called a heart condition, but what I recognized as the physical manifestation of carrying unbearable secrets for too long. He looked like he'd aged 30 years in the decade since Operation Highjump, his face hollowed out and his eyes carrying the weight of knowledge that had crushed his spirit even as his body remained functional. "They think they found all the copies," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment monitoring his failing systems. "They searched everywhere they thought to look, but they never thought to check the one place I knew they'd never search." He'd hidden the journal inside the wall of his childhood bedroom in his family's estate in Virginia, a house that had been preserved as historical landmark after his Arctic achievements made him famous. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The most dangerous document in American history had been concealed in a museum dedicated to celebrating the man who'd written it. I retrieved the journal 2 weeks after Byrd's funeral, during a public tour of the estate, when I was just another visitor paying respects to a national hero. The loose brick he'd described was exactly where he said it would be, and inside the cavity was a waterproof container holding not just his journal, but photographs that shouldn't have existed. Images he'd taken inside Agartha using a camera he'd somehow kept hidden from our government handlers during debriefing. The photographs were grainy by modern standards, black and white images shot with 1940s technology in lighting conditions that weren't designed for human eyes. But they showed enough. Crystalline architecture that couldn't be explained by geological processes, Ariane figures whose proportions were subtly wrong for human anatomy, and one particularly clear image of a disc-shaped craft hovering above Agartha's central plaza. The same type of vehicle that had attacked our fleet during our retreat from Antarctica. Also in the container was a map showing locations of what Byrd called other entrances, coordinates for sites around the world where the boundary between surface world and underground civilizations was thin enough to permit passage for those who knew what they were looking for. I've spent 77 years protecting these materials, moving them between hiding places whenever I felt surveillance was getting too close, always staying one step ahead of the men who would destroy this evidence if they knew it existed. The journal and photographs have been hidden in bank deposit boxes that were never registered to me, in storage facilities rented under false names, in the homes of people who died never knowing what I'd concealed in their attics or basements. But the final hiding place, the one where they've rested for the past 15 years, is perfect in its obviousness. They're buried beneath a memorial stone in Arlington National Cemetery, under the grave of Lieutenant William Kearns, who died in 1979 and who gave me permission before his death to use his plot for this purpose. The government men watching me never thought to monitor a grave that had been sealed for decades, never considered that the evidence they'd been searching for was located in one of the most secure and sacred locations in the United States. The coordinates Byrd documented describe 7 major entrances to the underground realm beyond the Antarctic location we discovered. One in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet, concealed in a monastery that has existed for over 1,000 years and whose monks have been guarding the entrance with knowledge passed down through generations. One beneath the Amazon rainforest, hidden in a region that indigenous tribes have declared forbidden territory and protected with isolation that anthropologists respect but don't understand. One under the ocean floor in the Pacific, accessible only through underwater caves that descend to depths that conventional diving equipment can't reach. One in the American Southwest, concealed inside a cave system that the Hopi people have considered sacred for centuries and described in their oral histories as the place where their ancestors emerged from previous worlds. 3 others in locations that Byrd marked only with coordinates, without descriptions, that would reveal what countries or governments currently control access to these sites. What I learned over the decades since Operation Highjump makes Admiral Byrd's journal even more significant than its documentation of Agatha. I learned it through careful attention to patterns in world events, through conversations with other military personnel who'd had experiences they couldn't officially discuss, and through information that was accidentally revealed by intelligence operatives who underestimated how much a supposedly harmless old man might understand from fragmentary data. The United States government didn't just classify our discoveries and order silence. They established ongoing contact with the Ariani, creating secret diplomatic channels that have operated continuously since 1947. The treaty they negotiated was simple. The Ariani would not intervene in human affairs as long as humanity didn't deploy nuclear weapons in ways that threatened planetary stability, and in return, surface governments would maintain the secret of their existence and prevent public knowledge that could lead to attempts to explore or exploit the underground civilizations. The UFO phenomenon that exploded after 1947 wasn't about visitors from other planets. It was about the Ariani increasing their monitoring of human nuclear capabilities, demonstrating their technology to military forces around the world as warning and reminder of the consequences that would follow if the treaty was violated. Every major UFO sighting near military installations, every encounter between aircraft and unidentified objects that could outmaneuver anything in our arsenal, every incident where nuclear missiles mysteriously went offline without explanation, these were the Ariani enforcing the agreement, reminding governments that they were being watched and that intervention remained a possibility if we crossed lines that had been carefully negotiated. The government's official position of dismissing UFO reports and ridiculing witnesses wasn't ignorance. It was policy, designed to prevent public awareness of a treaty that most citizens would never be allowed to know existed. But the treaty is failing, and that's why I'm breaking silence now, despite the consequences. Over the past 2 decades, as I've watched world events from the isolation of old age and declining health, I've seen the same patterns that preceded every previous civilization's collapse. Nuclear proliferation to unstable nations, international tensions escalating toward conflicts that could trigger cascading failures in diplomatic restraint, development of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems that introduce unpredictability the Ariani never anticipated when they issued their warnings in 1947. The threshold we're approaching isn't the same threshold we faced during the Cold War. It's more complex, more distributed, harder to monitor or prevent through the methods that have worked for 77 years. And I've seen the signs that the Ariani are preparing for intervention, increased UFO activity around military sites, disruptions of weapon systems that governments can't explain, and reports from sources I trust that suggest the underground civilizations are no longer content to wait and watch. The evidence I'm revealing includes something that Admiral Byrd only hinted at in his journal, but that I confirmed through decades of careful observation. The Ariani aren't the only non-human intelligence sharing our planet. There are other underground civilizations, some friendly to humanity and some decidedly not. Some in communication with the Ariani and others that operate independently with agendas we don't understand. The conspiracy theories about reptilian beings and subterranean empires aren't entirely wrong. They're garbled versions of truth that has been systematically suppressed and distorted. The hollow Earth isn't quite hollow, but it's far less solid than geology textbooks suggest, honeycombed with vast chambers and tunnel systems that connect pockets of reality where physical laws operate differently than they do on the surface. And some of those chambers contain the remains of civilizations that predate the Ariani, ruins of cultures that achieved technologies we're only beginning to imagine and destroyed themselves in ways that make nuclear war look merciful. I'm 98 years old and dying, and I no longer care about the threats that kept me silent for 77 years. The men watching from their black sedan across the street can't hurt me in any way that matters. They can't make death worse than it already is, can't threaten me with consequences more severe than the cancer that's consuming me from inside. What they can do is try to suppress this recording and the evidence I'm revealing, which is why I've taken precautions they won't anticipate. This recording has been uploaded to Dead Man's switches that will trigger if I don't enter specific codes at regular intervals. Codes that will stop being entered when I stop breathing. The coordinates to Lieutenant Kern's grave and the evidence buried there have been sent to journalists, researchers, and truth seekers around the world through channels that are already monitored, but whose numbers are too large to suppress effectively. Some will dismiss this as the ravings of a senile old man. Some will investigate and find nothing because they'll look in the wrong places or give up too easily, but some will find what I've hidden, will see the photographs and read Byrd's journal, and will understand that everything we've been told about our world and our history is a carefully constructed lie. My final warning: the message I'm dying to deliver because Admiral Byrd died trying to deliver it and failed. The Ariani intervention is coming sooner than anyone in positions of power seems to understand or acknowledge. The patterns are accelerating, the threshold approaching faster than models predicted when the treaty was negotiated. And the underground civilizations are losing patience with surface humanity's inability to control its destructive impulses. When intervention comes, not if, but when, it won't be the benevolent guidance that optimistic scientists hope for, or the violent conquest that paranoid militaries fear. It will be something stranger and more final: a quarantine. The Ariani have done this before with previous surface civilizations that threatened planetary stability. They have the capability to essentially seal off surface humanity from the deeper realms, creating barriers that will prevent us from accessing underground resources and knowledge, cutting us off from civilizations that have been sharing this planet with us since before we learned to build cities. Will be contained on the surface to either evolve beyond our current limitations or destroy ourselves without taking the rest of the planet's life with us. I don't know if revealing this evidence will change anything. Probably not. History suggests that humans don't learn from warnings, that we repeat the same mistakes regardless of how many previous civilizations have fallen into the same traps. But I'm delivering this testimony because silence has become unbearable, because I've spent 77 years watching the world move toward catastrophe while knowing the truth and being unable to share it. My name is James Caldwell, I'm 98 years old, and I was with Admiral Byrd in Antarctica in 1947 when we discovered that we're not alone on this planet, that we've never been alone, and that the beings who share this world with us are preparing to intervene in human affairs because we've proven ourselves incapable of the wisdom necessary to survive our own technological advancement. The evidence exists. The coordinates are Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, grave of Lieutenant William Kearns, 3 feet below the memorial stone on the western side. Everything Byrd documented, everything we witnessed, everything that's been suppressed for 77 years is there, waiting for someone brave enough to dig up truth that governments have literally buried. This is my final testimony, recorded in October 2024, released upon my death, which will probably occur within days or weeks of this recording being made. To those who dismiss this as delusion or fabrication, investigate. Go to Arlington. Excavate Kern's grave. See the evidence with your own eyes, and then ask yourself why so much effort has been expended to keep you from knowing what I've spent 77 years being forbidden to discuss. To those who believe, be careful. The truth I'm revealing is dangerous, not because it's false, but because it threatens the fundamental narratives that hold our civilization together. Knowledge of non-human intelligence sharing our planet, of underground civilizations that predate human history, of treaties and warnings that have been hidden from public awareness. This information will be suppressed with violence if necessary, and those who attempt to verify my testimony will face consequences that the watchers in black sedans have been prepared to deliver since 1947. And to the Ariani, if any of your people are monitoring this recording through whatever methods you use to observe surface humanity, I've kept your secret for 77 years. I've maintained silence despite the cost to my sanity and my soul. But I'm dying now, and the burden of that secret dies with me unless I pass it to others who might have the wisdom to act on the warnings you delivered. I hope humanity proves worthy of your patience. But I've lived long enough to know that hope is probably misplaced, and that the intervention you warned us about is inevitably approaching, carried on the momentum of our species' inability to learn from the mistakes of those who came before us.